There is a quiet contradiction in the body that most people never notice. The more still you remain, the more discomfort begins to appear, as if rest itself is slowly turning against you. A chair promises support, yet after enough time, it leaves behind stiffness, pressure, and a dull, persistent ache that feels strangely out of place. This is not how the human body was meant to feel during stillness, and yet it has become familiar. Somewhere between our distant past and our present habits, something subtle has shifted. If sitting is supposed to be a form of rest, then why does your body feel pain after sitting too long? There is a quiet moment that often goes unnoticed, sometime after the body is settled into a chair. At first, everything feels supported. The weight is distributed, the muscles seem to relax, and there is a sense that nothing more is required. For a short while, this stillness feels appropriate, even necessary. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something begins to change. A slight tension forms in the lower back. The hips feel heavier. The neck begins to search for a different position. None of these sensations arrive suddenly. They build in small layers, as if the body is gently resisting a condition it has entered without fully understanding. This experience feels ordinary today, but it carries a deeper question about what rest truly means for a human body. In modern life, rest is often associated with stillness. To stop moving is to recover. To sit is to conserve energy. Chairs, sofas, and other forms of support are designed around this assumption, offering a stable place where movement is no longer needed. But if this idea is placed against the longer arc of human history, it begins to look less certain. For most of the time that Homo sapiens has existed, stillness was rarely complete. Even in moments of rest, the body remained subtly active. A person might squat, lean, shift weight from one leg to another, or adjust position in response to the ground beneath them. These movements were not intentional in the way exercise is today. They were simply part of being in an environment that did not allow the body to remain fixed for long. The ground was uneven, the air temperature changed, sounds and subtle cues in the surroundings required attention. Rest existed, but it was rarely motionless. If we imagine a human body in a natural landscape tens of thousands of years ago, it is difficult to find a moment where it is completely still for an extended period. Even during sleep, the body adjusts. Muscles release and re-engage in cycles. The spine shifts slightly as pressure points change. This constant low-level movement appears to be part of how the body maintains comfort without creating strain. When this pattern is interrupted, when the body is placed into a position that remains unchanged, the experience of rest begins to shift. A chair, in its design, removes many of the small adjustments that would normally occur. It provides a flat, predictable surface. It holds the body in a specific angle. At first, this feels like support, but over time, the lack of variation becomes noticeable. The same areas of the body carry the same load without interruption. The muscles that would normally make small corrections become quieter. The joints remain in a limited range of motion. Instead of rest being a dynamic balance, it becomes a fixed state. This may explain why discomfort does not appear immediately. The body does not react to stillness as something dangerous in the short term, but as time continues, the absence of movement begins to matter. Pressure accumulates in certain areas. Circulation in small regions may slow slightly. The nervous system, which is constantly monitoring the condition of the body, begins to register these changes. The signals are subtle at first and need to shift. A sense of stiffness, but they gradually become more defined. This process suggests that what we call rest might not be the absence of movement, but rather a different kind of movement, one that is slower, less visible, and continuously adjusting. When this form of movement is removed, the body does not immediately fail, but it does begin to express a form of imbalance. The pain that eventually appears may not be a sudden problem, but the result of something that has been missing for a while. To understand why sitting leads to discomfort, it may be necessary to step away from the idea that stillness equals recovery, and instead consider whether the human body has always required motion, even in its quietest states, and whether the modern experience of sitting has quietly replaced a form of rest that once felt entirely different. If the body begins to feel discomfort, not because it is working too much, but because it has stopped changing, then the idea of rest becomes less about stopping and more about how the body continues to exist while it is not actively moving through space. There is a difference between being still and being inactive, and the human body seems to recognize this difference in ways that are not immediately obvious. When a person sits for a long time, the larger movements of walking or standing disappear, but something else also fades with them. The small, almost invisible adjustments that usually take place without thought begin to diminish. These are the shifts of weight that happen when the ground is uneven, the slight repositioning of the spine when balance changes, the subtle engagement of muscles that respond to tiny variations in posture. In a natural environment, these movements occur continuously, not as effort, but as a response to surroundings that are never completely stable. Even when a person appears to be resting, the body is quietly active, maintaining a kind of internal conversation between muscles, joints, and the surface beneath them. This constant adjustment does not draw attention because it does not feel like work. It feels like nothing at all, but its absence can be felt. A chair simplifies the environment. It creates a surface that does not change and asks the body to adapt to it rather than respond to variation. The hips settle into a fixed position, the spine aligns into a limited range, and the feet often remain planted without needing to adjust. At first, this predictability feels comfortable. There is no need to respond to instability, no need to correct balance. But over time, the lack of change becomes a condition the body must endure rather than engage with. The muscles that would normally make continuous low-level corrections become less active. They are not stretched or contracted in varied ways. Instead, they hold a position, often for longer than they were originally adapted to do. This holding is not always strong enough to feel like effort, but it is steady enough to create fatigue. In earlier human environments, rest might have involved squatting near a fire, leaning against a surface, or sitting on uneven ground. Each of these positions naturally encouraged movement, even if it was minimal. The body would shift to relieve pressure, to adjust to temperature, or to respond to subtle changes in the surroundings. There was no single correct position, and no expectation that one position would be maintained for long. This created a pattern where rest was distributed across different parts of the body rather than concentrated in a few areas. Over time, no single muscle or joint carried the same load continuously. When this pattern is replaced with a fixed posture, the distribution changes. Certain areas begin to carry more consistent pressure. The lower back may remain slightly curved without variation. The hips may bear weight in the same way for extended periods. The neck may hold the head in a forward position with only minor adjustments. None of these positions are inherently harmful in the short term. The body can tolerate them. But the longer they are maintained without change, the more they begin to diverge from the conditions under which the body developed its expectations of rest. This divergence does not produce an immediate response. It builds gradually, as the systems within the body continue to operate in a context that provides less variation than they are accustomed to. The result is not a sudden failure, but a slow accumulation of signals that something is not being balanced. The discomfort that appears after sitting for a long time may be one of the simplest expressions of this imbalance. It is not necessarily a sign that sitting itself is unnatural, but that the way sitting occurs without variation, without interruption, and without the small adjustments that once defined rest does not fully align with how the body has long been shaped to exist in a state of ease. To follow this idea further, it becomes necessary to look more closely at what the body is actually doing during these small, continuous movements, and why they seem to matter even when they are barely noticeable. If these small, continuous movements are so quiet that they are rarely noticed, it may seem uncertain whether they truly matter. Yet the body appears to depend on them in ways that only become visible when they are no longer present. In a state of gentle, ongoing adjustment, different muscles take turns carrying weight, even if only for a moment. A slight shift in the hips redistributes pressure across the pelvis. A small change in the angle of the spine alters how the upper body is supported. Even the act of breathing, when not restricted, creates subtle motion through the ribs and the surrounding muscles. None of these changes are large enough to draw attention, but together they create a pattern where no single part of the body remains unchanged for too long. This pattern may be one of the simplest forms of balance the body maintains without conscious effort. When sitting becomes prolonged and unvaried, this pattern begins to fade. The same surfaces of the body remain in contact with the same points of support. The same groups of muscles remain either slightly engaged or slightly inactive without interruption. Over time, this consistency begins to replace variation. The body, which has long adapted to distribute effort and pressure across changing positions, is placed into a condition where distribution becomes limited. The effect is not immediate discomfort, but a gradual narrowing of how the body experiences its own position. Areas that would normally have moments of relief continue to bear weight. Muscles that would briefly contract and release remain in a more constant state. Joints that would move through small ranges stay within a fixed angle. This does not create pain instantly, because the body is capable of tolerating stability for a period of time. But tolerance is not the same as preference. The longer this condition continues, the more the absence of change becomes noticeable. If we consider how early humans might have paused during the day, the idea of a fixed posture becomes difficult to maintain. The ground beneath them would not have offered a uniform surface. Even a simple seated position would involve slight adjustments as the body responded to uneven terrain, shifting temperature, or the need to remain aware of the surroundings. These adjustments would not have been deliberate corrections. They would have been continuous responses to an environment that never remained completely still. In this way, the environment itself invited movement, even during rest. The body did not need to remember to move, it simply responded. In contrast, modern environments often remove the need to respond. Surfaces are flat, temperatures are controlled, and the surrounding space is predictable. These conditions reduce the number of signals that would normally lead to small adjustments. Without these signals, the body can remain in one position for longer than it might have in the past. This extended stillness may feel efficient, but it also creates a situation where the body is no longer guided by subtle changes in its environment. Instead, it must rely on internal signals that take time to build. By the time these signals become clear, they often appear as stiffness, discomfort, or a need to shift abruptly rather than gradually. This shift from continuous low-level adjustment to delayed, more noticeable correction may be one of the reasons why sitting for long periods feels different from other forms of rest. The body is not being asked to work harder, but it is being asked to remain unchanged for longer than it is accustomed to. The discomfort that eventually emerges may not be a direct consequence of sitting itself, but of the absence of the small, ongoing movements that once defined how the body maintained ease. When these movements are present, rest can feel balanced and sustainable. When they are absent, rest becomes something that slowly accumulates strain. This suggests that the experience of pain after sitting too long may begin not with the act of sitting, but with the quiet disappearance of movement that the body has relied on for much of its history. To understand this more clearly, it becomes necessary to look beyond the surface of posture and examine how the internal structures of the body, muscles, joints, and connective tissues respond when movement is reduced but not entirely removed. Beneath the surface of stillness, the body is rarely as quiet as it appears. Even when a person seems to be resting, there is a continuous exchange of tension and release taking place across muscles, joints, and connective tissues. This activity is not deliberate. It does not require attention. Yet it forms a background rhythm that supports how the body maintains its shape, its balance, and its sense of ease. When this rhythm is present, rest does not feel heavy or confined. It feels stable, but also flexible, as if the body can shift at any moment without resistance. When this rhythm fades, stillness begins to feel different. It becomes something that must be held rather than something that can adapt. The muscles of the body are not designed only for large, visible actions like walking or lifting. They also operate in quieter ways, making constant, small corrections to maintain posture and distribute load. These corrections are often so subtle that they pass unnoticed. A slight engagement in the lower back supports the curve of the spine. Small, stabilizing muscles around the hips adjust to keep balance centered. The muscles around the neck respond to tiny shifts in head position. None of these actions are strong enough to feel like effort, but together they prevent any one area from bearing continuous strain. In environments that encourage variation, these adjustments occur naturally. The body responds to uneven ground, to shifts in temperature, to changes in orientation. Each response is small, but it changes the pattern of muscle use just enough to prevent prolonged repetition. Over time, this creates a form of distributed activity, where no single muscle remains in the same state for too long. Some muscles engage briefly, then release. Others take over for a moment, then pass the role along. This ongoing exchange may be one of the ways the body avoids the buildup of localized fatigue. When sitting for long periods, this exchange becomes more limited. The body is placed into a position where fewer adjustments are required. The ground does not shift, the balance does not need correction, and the surrounding environment remains stable. As a result, many of the small stabilizing muscles reduce their activity. At the same time, other muscles may remain slightly engaged to hold the posture in place. This creates an imbalance in the usual pattern of muscle use. Instead of a continuous rotation of activity, certain muscles remain in a low-level state of contraction for extended periods, while others become less active than usual. This change is not immediately uncomfortable, because the level of effort is low, but the duration is longer than what these muscles typically experience. Over time, the lack of variation begins to matter. Muscles that remain engaged without interruption can develop a sense of fatigue, even if they are not working hard. Muscles that are less active may lose some of their responsiveness, making it more difficult for them to assist when a change in position is needed. The result is not a sharp signal, but a gradual shift in how the body feels. The posture that once seemed neutral begins to feel restrictive. The desire to move becomes more noticeable, not because the body needs a large action, but because it has been missing the small ones. If we place this pattern within a longer human context, it becomes easier to see why these small movements might be expected rather than optional. For much of human history, the body was rarely supported in a way that removed the need for adjustment. Surfaces were not designed to match the shape of the body. Instead, the body adapted to surfaces that were varied and unpredictable. This required continuous, low-level engagement from muscles that helped maintain balance and comfort. Over time, this may have shaped an expectation within the body that even during rest, some level of movement would continue. When that expectation is not met, the body does not immediately react, but it does begin to signal a difference. The discomfort that arises after sitting for a long time may be one of the ways this difference becomes visible. It suggests that the body's design is not centered around complete stillness, but around a form of rest that includes constant, subtle motion. To understand this further, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how these small muscle activities interact with other systems in the body, and how their reduction begins to influence not just posture, but the internal environment that supports comfort and function. When these small muscle activities continue in the background, they do more than simply hold the body upright. They also influence how other systems within the body remain in balance. Movement, even at a very subtle level, helps maintain a gentle flow through tissues. It allows fluids to shift, pressures to redistribute, and signals to travel without becoming concentrated in one place. This process is quiet and continuous, and for most of human history, it has likely been present without interruption. The body does not need to think about it. It unfolds naturally as long as there is variation in position and posture. When this variation is reduced, the internal environment begins to change in ways that are not immediately visible, but gradually become noticeable. One of the simplest examples can be observed in how pressure is distributed across the body. In a state of ongoing adjustment, pressure points rarely remain constant. A small shift in posture relieves one area while increasing load in another, creating a rotation that prevents any single region from bearing weight for too long. This rotation does not eliminate pressure, but it spreads it across time and space. When sitting becomes prolonged and unchanged, this rotation slows or stops. The same areas remain in contact with the same surfaces, and the distribution of pressure becomes more fixed. Over time, this can create a sense of heaviness or compression, particularly in regions that are designed to share load rather than carry it continuously. Alongside this, the movement of fluids within the body may also become more limited. Blood, for example, relies not only on the action of the heart but also on the assistance of muscles that contract and relax as the body moves. These contractions help guide circulation through smaller vessels, supporting a steady flow. When the body is still for extended periods, this assistance is reduced. Circulation continues, but the subtle support provided by movement becomes less active. In many cases, this change is small and does not cause immediate problems. However, it may contribute to the gradual sensation of stiffness or discomfort, as tissues experience a more constant, unchanging state rather than a dynamic one. A similar pattern can be observed in the spaces around joints. Joints are not fixed hinges. They are living structures that respond to movement by distributing forces and maintaining flexibility. Small, regular movements help keep these structures within a comfortable range. When joints remain in a limited position for a long time, the surrounding tissues begin to adapt to that position. This adaptation is not harmful in itself, but it reduces the variety of movement that the joint experiences. When a change finally occurs, when the body shifts after a long period of sitting, it can feel as though the joint is resistant or slow to respond. This sensation is often described as stiffness, but it may be more accurately understood as the result of reduced variation over time. If we consider how the human body has existed across most of its history, it is unlikely that these internal processes were ever separated from movement for extended periods. Even in moments of rest, the body remained part of an environment that required continuous adjustment. The ground beneath the body was not uniform, the surrounding conditions were not constant, and the need to remain aware of the environment encouraged subtle shifts in posture. These conditions ensured that internal systems' pressure distribution, fluid movement, joint flexibility were supported by ongoing, low-level activity. In contrast, modern environments often allow the body to remain in one position with very little need for change. The chair supports the body in a way that reduces the demand for adjustment. The environment remains stable, and the signals that would normally prompt movement are reduced. As a result, the internal systems that rely on variation continue to operate, but with less external input. Over time, this creates a state where the body is maintaining itself in a more static condition than it was originally shaped to handle. The discomfort that appears after sitting for too long may not be caused by a single factor, but by the combined effect of these small changes accumulating. Pressure becomes concentrated rather than distributed. Fluid movement becomes steady but less assisted. Joints remain within a narrower range of motion. None of these changes are extreme on their own, but together they shift the internal environment away from the dynamic balance that the body has long maintained. This suggests that the experience of pain is not simply a reaction to posture, but a response to the absence of variation that once defined how the body functioned during rest. To continue understanding this process, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how the body interprets these changes, and why it chooses to express them through the specific sensation we recognize as pain, rather than through other signals that might be less noticeable. When these subtle changes begin to accumulate, the body does not respond immediately with something as clear as pain. Instead, it first produces quieter signals, ones that are easy to ignore or reinterpret. A slight urge to adjust position, a feeling that the posture is no longer quite right, a sense that the body is becoming less at ease. These early signals do not interrupt attention. They exist in the background, much like the small movements that once maintained balance. But as the conditions remain unchanged, the signals gradually become more defined. The body, which has been monitoring pressure, tension, and movement without interruption, begins to translate these observations into something that can no longer be overlooked. This transition from subtle awareness to noticeable discomfort suggests that pain is not the first response, but a later stage in a longer process. It is a way for the body to make certain that a change in behavior eventually occurs. Before reaching that point, the body relies on a range of less intense sensations to encourage movement. These sensations are often described as stiffness, restlessness, or a need to shift position. They are not signals of damage, but indications that the current state is becoming less compatible with the body's preferred conditions. If these signals are followed, if the person shifts, stands, or changes posture, the process is often interrupted before it becomes more pronounced. The internal balance is restored through variation, and the sensation fades. However, in environments where sitting is expected to continue, these early signals may be delayed or suppressed. Attention is directed elsewhere, and the body remains in the same position despite the growing need for change. Over time, the quieter signals lose their effectiveness. They no longer lead to immediate adjustment, and the body begins to rely on stronger forms of communication. Pain, in this context, can be understood as a signal that carries more weight. It is more difficult to ignore, more likely to prompt action. It does not necessarily indicate that harm has occurred, but that the current state has been maintained beyond what the body finds sustainable. This interpretation places pain within a broader system of communication rather than as an isolated problem. It becomes one part of a sequence that begins with subtle imbalance and ends with a clear request for change. If we look at this process through the lens of human history, it becomes easier to understand why such a system might exist. In environments where movement was constant and variation was unavoidable, early signals would have been enough. A slight discomfort would naturally lead to a shift in position because the surroundings themselves encouraged movement. The body did not need to escalate its signals because the conditions rarely remained unchanged for long. In modern settings, however, the environment often allows the same posture to be maintained without interruption. The chair remains stable, the task continues, and the need to move is not always acted upon. In this context, the body's early signals may not produce the intended response. As a result, the system adapts by increasing the intensity of its communication. Pain becomes more likely, not because the body is failing, but because the usual pathway from sensation to movement has been altered. This shift highlights a subtle mismatch between the body's expectations and the conditions it now experiences. The body continues to operate as if variation will occur naturally, while the environment allows stillness to persist. The signals that were once sufficient must become stronger to achieve the same outcome. The discomfort felt after sitting for too long may therefore represent not just a physical response, but a communication that has been amplified over time. It reflects a process where small imbalances left unaddressed gradually require a clearer expression. Understanding this process does not remove the sensation, but it changes how it can be interpreted. Rather than seeing pain as a sudden problem, it can be viewed as the final stage of a sequence that began much earlier, when the first quiet signals of imbalance appeared and went unanswered. This perspective invites a deeper question about how the body decides when to move from subtle awareness to stronger sensation, and what determines the threshold at which discomfort becomes something that can no longer be ignored. If the body responds to prolonged stillness with signals that grow stronger over time, it becomes important to consider whether this response is something new, or whether it reflects patterns that have existed for much longer. The human body did not emerge in environments where remaining seated for extended periods was common. For most of its history, it existed in conditions that required frequent changes in position, not only for survival, but as part of everyday activity. Movement was not a separate task. It was woven into nearly every moment, from searching for food to responding to subtle changes in the surroundings. Even in periods that might be described as rest, the body remained part of a landscape that did not allow complete stillness. The ground was rarely flat, the need for awareness remained, and the body adjusted continuously in response. When viewed across this longer timescale, the experience of sitting for long durations appears as a relatively recent pattern. The body, shaped by generations of interaction with varied and unpredictable environments, may not have developed expectations for remaining in one fixed posture for extended periods. This does not mean that early humans never paused or remained still. They likely did, but the nature of that stillness was different. It was often brief, interrupted, or accompanied by subtle adjustments that maintained variation. The idea of maintaining a single, consistent posture for long stretches of time may not have been a regular part of daily life. Evidence from anthropology and archaeology suggests that early human populations spent much of their time in motion or in positions that allowed for flexibility. Squatting, for example, is a posture that appears frequently in many traditional societies and requires continuous engagement from the muscles to maintain balance. Unlike sitting in a chair, squatting does not fix the body into a rigid structure. It allows for small shifts, changes in weight distribution, and easy transitions between positions. Similarly, resting on uneven ground or leaning against natural surfaces would have encouraged the body to remain responsive rather than fixed. These patterns of movement and rest were not designed consciously. They emerge from the interaction between the body and its environment. Over long periods, this interaction may have shaped the body's internal expectations, how it anticipates pressure, how it distributes effort, and how it responds to stillness. When these expectations are met, the body maintains a sense of ease. When they are not, subtle signals begin to appear, eventually leading to discomfort. The transition from these older patterns to modern habits did not occur all at once. It developed gradually as human environments became more structured and predictable. The introduction of built spaces, controlled surfaces, and furniture designed for prolonged sitting created new conditions for the body. These conditions reduced the need for constant adjustment and allowed for longer periods of stillness. While this brought certain forms of efficiency and comfort, it also introduced patterns that may not fully align with the body's long-standing adaptations. From an evolutionary perspective, changes in behavior can occur much faster than changes in the body itself. Cultural and environmental shifts can happen within generations, while biological adaptations often require much longer timescales. This creates a situation where the body continues to operate based on patterns that were established under different conditions. The experience of discomfort after sitting for too long may be one expression of this difference. It reflects a body that expects variation, encountering an environment that allows consistency to persist. This does not suggest that modern behaviors are inherently incompatible with the body, but that they may introduce conditions the body has not fully adjusted to over evolutionary time. The signals that arise in these situations can be understood as part of an ongoing dialogue between past adaptations and present circumstances. The body continues to interpret its current state through systems that were shaped in a different context. When the current environment provides less variation than expected, the body responds by signaling a need for change. This perspective shifts the focus away from sitting as a simple cause of pain and toward a broader understanding of how human behavior has changed relative to the body's history. It suggests that the discomfort felt after prolonged sitting may be connected not only to what the body is doing now, but to what it has been shaped to expect over many thousands of years. To explore this further, it becomes necessary to look more closely at specific features of the human body, its spine, its joints, and its musculature, and how these structures reflect a history of movement that may still influence how the body responds to stillness today. If the body carries within it a long history of movement, then some of that history can be seen in how its structures are arranged. The spine, for example, is not a rigid column designed to hold a single fixed shape. It is composed of many segments, each capable of small degrees of motion. These segments are connected in a way that allows flexibility rather than permanence. When the body shifts position, even slightly, the distribution of load across the spine changes. Different areas share responsibility over time, and no single segment is meant to remain under the same conditions without interruption. This design suggests a system that anticipates variation rather than constancy. When the spine is placed into a seated posture and held there for long periods, this variation becomes limited. The natural curves of the spine may still be present, but they are maintained within a narrow range. Instead of moving through small adjustments, the spine begins to hold a more consistent shape. The muscles that support it respond by maintaining a steady level of engagement, often without the alternating pattern that would normally occur. Over time, this steady engagement can feel less like support and more like a quiet form of effort that does not fully release. The experience is subtle at first, but it can gradually contribute to the sense of discomfort that develops during prolonged sitting. A similar pattern can be observed in the joints of the hips and knees. These joints are capable of moving through a wide range of positions, allowing the body to adapt to different terrains and activities. In many traditional settings, people shift between standing, walking, squatting, and sitting on the ground, each position placing the joints in a slightly different configuration. This variation helps maintain a balance in how forces are applied and how tissues respond. When sitting in a chair becomes the dominant posture, the range of positions used during rest becomes more limited. The hips remain flexed, the knees stay at a similar angle, and the opportunity for variation is reduced. The joints are not damaged by this position in the short term, but they are exposed to less diversity in movement. Over time, this reduction in variation may influence how the joints feel when a change is finally introduced. The sensation of stiffness after sitting for a long time may reflect this temporary narrowing of movement rather than a sudden problem. The body, having remained within a limited range, takes time to re-engage with a broader one. Muscles around these joints play a similar role. They are not only responsible for generating movement, but also for responding to changes in position. In a dynamic environment, muscles engage and release in response to shifting demands. This creates a pattern where activity is shared and rotated across different groups. When movement is reduced, this pattern becomes less varied. Some muscles remain active to maintain posture, while others are used less frequently. This uneven distribution can create a sense of imbalance, where certain areas feel fatigued while others feel less responsive. These observations suggest that the structures of the body, its spine, its joints, and its muscles, are organized around the expectation of ongoing change. They are not designed for a single posture, even one that feels comfortable at first. Instead, they appear to function best when they are allowed to move through a range of positions, even if those movements are small and slow. When this range is restricted for extended periods, the body begins to signal that something is missing. If we return to the broader context of human history, this arrangement becomes more understandable. For much of that history, the body was rarely placed into a condition where its structures remained unchanged for long durations. The environment itself introduced variation, and the body responded accordingly. Over time, this interaction may have reinforced the importance of movement, not as an occasional activity, but as a continuous background process. The discomfort that arises during prolonged sitting may therefore be less about the presence of a specific posture, and more about the absence of variation that the body has long depended on. This perspective invites a closer look at how these structural features interact with the systems that interpret sensation, and how the body decides when a lack of movement has become significant enough to require a clearer response. If the structures of the body suggest an expectation of variation, then the question becomes how the body recognizes when that expectation is no longer being met. The transition from ease to discomfort does not occur at a fixed moment, and it does not follow a simple threshold that is the same for everyone. Instead, it appears to emerge from a gradual process in which the body compares its current state with patterns it has experienced repeatedly over time. These patterns are not stored as clear memories, but as tendencies, ways in which tissues respond, how joints move, how muscles alternate between engagement and release. When the present condition begins to differ from these tendencies for long enough, the body starts to signal that something is out of balance. This signaling is not limited to one system. It involves a coordination between physical structures and the nervous system that interprets their state. The nervous system does not simply detect damage, it also monitors pressure, tension, and the degree of movement occurring in different parts of the body. When variation is present, these signals fluctuate. They rise and fall, shift from one region to another, and create a pattern that the body recognizes as stable. When variation is reduced, the signals become more consistent. The same areas report similar conditions over extended periods, and this consistency itself becomes a form of information. It suggests that the body is no longer changing in the ways it usually does. At first, this information may be interpreted as neutral. The body continues to function, and there is no immediate need to respond. But as time passes, the continued absence of change begins to take on meaning. The nervous system may interpret prolonged uniformity as a sign that the current state is not being adjusted in response to internal or external conditions. In environments where movement was once continuous, such a lack of adjustment might have indicated that something was limiting the body's ability to respond. In this way, the signal of discomfort can be understood not only as a response to physical conditions, but also as a response to the absence of expected variation. This interpretation does not require the body to know anything in a conscious sense. It reflects a system that has been shaped by repeated interactions with environments where change was constant. Over time, the body may have developed a sensitivity not only to extremes, but also to the lack of change itself. When sitting for a long period, the uniformity of posture, pressure, and muscle activity creates a pattern that differs from this long-established background. The longer this pattern continues, the more likely it is to be interpreted as something that requires attention. This may help explain why the discomfort of prolonged sitting often feels diffuse rather than localized. It is not always tied to a single point of strain, but to a broader sense that the body is not being used in the way it expects. The urge to move does not always come from a clear source. It arises as a general need to restore variation, to reintroduce the shifts and adjustments that have been absent. When movement finally occurs, when the body stands, stretches, or changes position, the signals begin to change again. Pressure is redistributed, muscles alter their activity, joints move through a wider range. The nervous system receives a different pattern of input, and the sense of imbalance begins to resolve. This resolution does not require a large action. Even small changes can be enough to shift the pattern and reduce discomfort. This suggests that the body is not seeking a specific posture as much as it is seeking change itself. If this is the case, then the discomfort associated with sitting may not be tied to the act of sitting alone, but to the duration and uniformity of that state. The body is not resisting stillness in all forms, but prolonged stillness without variation. This distinction points toward a broader understanding of how the body interacts with its environment. It suggests that comfort is not simply the absence of strain, but the presence of ongoing, subtle change. Within this framework, pain becomes one way the body signals that change has been missing for too long. To understand why this signal takes the specific form that it does, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how the nervous system translates physical conditions into sensation, and why certain patterns are expressed as discomfort rather than as other forms of awareness. If the structures of the body suggest an expectation of variation, then the question becomes how the body recognizes when that expectation is no longer being met. The transition from ease to discomfort does not occur at a fixed moment, and it does not follow a simple threshold that is the same for everyone. Instead, it appears to emerge from a gradual process in which the body compares its current state with patterns it has experienced repeatedly over time. These patterns are not stored as clear memories, but as tendencies, ways in which tissues respond, how joints move, how muscles alternate between engagement and release. When the present condition begins to differ from these tendencies for long enough, the body starts to signal that something is out of balance. This signaling is not limited to one system. It involves a coordination between physical structures and the nervous system that interprets their state. The nervous system does not simply detect damage, it also monitors pressure, tension, and the degree of movement occurring in different parts of the body. When variation is present, these signals fluctuate. They rise and fall, shift from one region to another, and create a pattern that the body recognizes as stable. When variation is reduced, the signals become more consistent. The same areas report similar conditions over extended periods, and this consistency itself becomes a form of information. It suggests that the body is no longer changing in the ways it usually does. At first, this information may be interpreted as neutral. The body continues to function, and there is no immediate need to respond. But as time passes, the continued absence of change begins to take on meaning. The nervous system may interpret prolonged uniformity as a sign that the current state is not being adjusted in response to internal or external conditions. In environments where movement was once continuous, such a lack of adjustment might have indicated that something was limiting the body's ability to respond. In this way, the signal of discomfort can be understood not only as a response to physical conditions, but also as a response to the absence of expected variation. This interpretation does not require the body to know anything in a conscious sense. It reflects a system that has been shaped by repeated interactions with environments where change was constant. Over time, the body may have developed a sensitivity not only to extremes, but also to the lack of change itself. When sitting for a long period, the uniformity of posture, pressure, and muscle activity creates a pattern that differs from this long-established background. The longer this pattern continues, the more likely it is to be interpreted as something that requires attention. This may help explain why the discomfort of prolonged sitting often feels diffuse rather than localized. It is not always tied to a single point of strain, but to a broader sense that the body is not being used in the way it expects. The urge to move does not always come from a clear source. It arises as a general need to restore variation, to reintroduce the shifts and adjustments that have been absent. When movement finally occurs, when the body stands, stretches, or changes position, the signals begin to change again. Pressure is redistributed, muscles alter their activity, joints move through a wider range. The nervous system receives a different pattern of input, and the sense of imbalance begins to resolve. This resolution does not require a large action. Even small changes can be enough to shift the pattern and reduce discomfort. This suggests that the body is not seeking a specific posture as much as it is seeking change itself. If this is the case, then the discomfort associated with sitting may not be tied to the act of sitting alone, but to the duration and uniformity of that state. The body is not resisting stillness in all forms, but prolonged stillness without variation. This distinction points toward a broader understanding of how the body interacts with its environment. It suggests that comfort is not simply the absence of strain, but the presence of ongoing, subtle change. Within this framework, pain becomes one way the body signals that change has been missing for too long. To understand why this signal takes the specific form that it does, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how the nervous system translates physical conditions into sensation, and why certain patterns are expressed as discomfort rather than as other forms of awareness. There is a moment in human history when the environment around the body began to change in a way that did not come from nature, but from deliberate design. Surfaces became flatter, more predictable, and shaped to hold the body in specific positions. Among these changes, the introduction of the chair stands out as a quiet but significant shift. It offered a new way to rest, one that reduced the need for balance, removed the irregularities of the ground, and allowed the body to remain in a stable posture for longer than before. At first, this might seem like a simple improvement, a refinement of comfort, but when placed within the longer timeline of human experience, it represents something more unusual. For most of human history, there was no consistent object designed to support the body in a seated position at a fixed angle. Resting often involved the ground itself, or natural forms that did not fully match the shape of the body. These surfaces required continuous adjustment. They did not hold the body in place, and they did not remove the need for subtle movement. The emergence of the chair changed this relationship. Instead of adapting to the environment, the body was now being supported by an environment that had been shaped to reduce variation. Early forms of seating existed in certain cultures, often associated with status or specific activities, but they were not a universal feature of daily life. Many people continued to sit on the ground, squat, or alternate between positions that allowed for movement. It was only over time, as built environments became more structured and daily activities became more centered around fixed locations, that the chair became a common part of everyday experience. This gradual shift introduced a new pattern: the ability to remain seated, supported, and largely unchanged for extended periods. From a practical perspective, this brought advantages. It allowed for tasks that required focus and stability. It reduced the physical effort needed to maintain posture. It created a sense of ease that could be sustained without constant adjustment. But from the perspective of the body, this new form of rest may have introduced a condition that had not been common before: a prolonged, stable posture with minimal variation. The chair does not demand movement. It does not respond to the body's need to shift. It remains constant, and in doing so, it allows the body to remain constant as well. This is where the difference becomes more apparent. In natural settings, rest was often shaped by interaction. The body responded to uneven surfaces, changing temperatures, and the need to remain aware of the surroundings. These factors encouraged continuous, low-level movement. In contrast, the chair removes many of these influences. It creates a controlled environment where the body can remain in one position without interruption. This change does not immediately conflict with the body's abilities. The body can adapt to the chair, and in many cases, it does so without noticeable difficulty at first. But as the duration of sitting increases, the absence of variation begins to have an effect. The structures of the body, its spine, its joints, its muscles, continue to operate, but within a more limited range. The signals that would normally prompt small adjustments are reduced, and the body remains in a state that is stable but less dynamic. Over time, this may lead to the gradual emergence of discomfort, not because the chair itself is harmful, but because it allows a pattern to persist that the body has not historically experienced for long periods. The chair, then, can be seen not just as an object, but as part of a broader shift in how humans interact with their environment. It represents a move towards stability and predictability, away from variation and responsiveness. This shift does not need to be understood as a mistake, but as a change that carries certain consequences. The body, shaped by a long history of movement and adjustment, continues to respond according to those patterns, even when the environment has changed. The discomfort that appears after sitting for too long may reflect this ongoing interaction between past adaptation and present condition. To understand this interaction more clearly, it becomes necessary to look at how other aspects of the modern environment reinforce this pattern, and how the combination of these factors further extends the duration of stillness beyond what the body may have once experienced. As the chair became more common, it did not exist in isolation. It appeared alongside other changes that shaped how time and space were organized in daily life. Activities that once took place across varied environments began to move into fixed locations. Work, rest, and even moments of quiet reflection increasingly occurred within enclosed spaces where the surroundings remained stable. The ground was replaced by floors that did not shift. The air became more controlled. Light could be extended beyond natural cycles. Within these environments, the chair found its place as part of a larger system that reduced the need for movement. This system did not require the body to adapt moment by moment. Instead, it offered continuity, a space where tasks could continue without interruption, and where posture could remain unchanged for longer than before. At first, this continuity may have felt like a form of relief. There was less need to respond to uneven terrain or shifting conditions. The body could settle, and in doing so, attention could be directed elsewhere. Over time, however, this settling began to extend beyond what had once been typical. The duration of stillness increased, not because the body demanded it, but because the environment allowed it. The signals that would normally encourage movement changes in surface, temperature, or surrounding activity became less frequent. In their place, a different rhythm emerged, one that was guided more by tasks and schedules than by physical cues. Within this rhythm, the body often remained seated, even as internal signals began to change. This shift can be understood as a gradual separation between the body's natural prompts and the structure of the environment. In earlier conditions, the need to move was often aligned with the environment itself. A change in position would occur because something in the surroundings required it. In more controlled settings, this alignment becomes less direct. The environment remains constant, and the decision to move depends more on conscious choice than on immediate physical necessity. As a result, the body may remain in one position beyond the point where subtle adjustments would have naturally occurred. The chair in this context becomes part of a larger pattern that supports extended stillness. It is not only the design of the chair, but the stability of the entire environment that contributes to this effect. The body is placed in a situation where variation is no longer required, and where the usual triggers for movement are reduced. This does not create discomfort immediately, because the body can adapt to stable conditions for a time. But as the duration extends, the absence of change begins to influence how the body feels. The internal processes that rely on variation continue, but with less external input. Pressure remains concentrated in the same areas, muscles maintain similar levels of engagement, and joints remain within a limited range. Over time, these conditions may lead to the gradual buildup of signals that something is not being balanced. It is important to note that this pattern is not necessarily the result of a single choice, but of a broader shift in how human life is organized. The design of spaces, the nature of tasks, and the expectations of daily routines all contribute to the amount of time spent sitting. The body responds to these conditions not with immediate resistance, but with a sequence of signals that begin quietly and become more noticeable over time. The discomfort that arises after sitting for too long may therefore be understood as part of this broader context. It is not only about posture, but about how the environment has been shaped to allow stillness to continue without interruption. This perspective highlights the importance of looking beyond individual positions and considering the patterns that surround them. The chair is one element, but it operates within a system that extends the duration of stillness and reduces the need for variation. The body, shaped by a different set of conditions, continues to respond according to its long-standing patterns. The signals it produces, whether subtle or more pronounced, reflect an ongoing interaction between these patterns and the environment in which they now exist. To explore this interaction further, it becomes necessary to consider how time itself is experienced differently in these settings, and how the length of uninterrupted sitting may play a role in shaping the sensations that eventually emerge. When the environment allows stillness to continue without interruption, time itself begins to take on a different role in how the body experiences posture. In earlier conditions, time spent in any one position was often limited by the surroundings. The need to move did not rely on a decision measured by minutes or hours. It arose naturally from changes in the environment, shifts in light, variations in temperature, the need to respond to sound or movement. These factors created a pattern where time in a single posture was often broken into shorter intervals, even if those interruptions were small. The body did not need to keep track of how long it had remained still, because the environment rarely allowed stillness to extend beyond a certain point. In modern settings, this pattern changes. The environment becomes stable enough that time can pass without requiring a change in position. A person may sit and remain engaged in a task, while the external conditions remain largely unchanged. The absence of natural interruptions allows time to accumulate in a way that was less common before. This accumulation is not always felt directly. At first, the body adapts to the posture, and the sense of stillness may even feel comfortable. But as time continues, the internal processes that depend on variation begin to experience a different pattern, one where the same conditions persist longer than expected. The body does not measure time in the way a clock does. It does not count minutes or track duration with precision. Instead, it responds to the continuity of conditions. When pressure, muscle activity, and joint position remain similar for an extended period, the body begins to register this continuity as a form of sameness. Over time, this sameness becomes more noticeable, not because of the passage of time itself, but because of the lack of change within that time. The signals that emerge, stiffness, discomfort, a need to shift, are tied to this continuity rather than to a specific duration. This may explain why the experience of discomfort can vary from one situation to another. The same amount of time spent sitting does not always produce the same sensation. If small movements or variations occur within that time, the body continues to receive changing signals, and the sense of imbalance may be reduced. If the posture remains more fixed, the continuity becomes stronger, and the body is more likely to respond with noticeable discomfort. In this way, time is not the only factor. It is the combination of time and uniformity that shapes how the body feels. From a historical perspective, this combination may have been less common. Time could pass, but it was often accompanied by change. Even during rest, the body remained part of an environment that introduced variation. The continuity of a single posture was frequently interrupted, and the body did not experience long stretches of unchanging conditions. As a result, the internal systems that respond to variation continued to operate within their expected patterns. In contrast, modern environments allow both time and uniformity to extend together. The body can remain in a single posture while the surroundings remain constant, and this combination creates a new kind of experience, one where the absence of change becomes more pronounced as time passes. The discomfort that arises in this context may be understood as a response to this extended continuity. It reflects a body that is sensitive not only to what is happening, but also to what is not happening, the absence of the small adjustments that once marked the passage of time during rest. This perspective suggests that the question is not only how long a person sits, but how that time is experienced by the body. If time passes with variation, the body continues to adjust. If time passes without change, the body begins to signal a need for it. The pain that eventually appears may therefore be less about duration alone, and more about the relationship between time and movement. It emerges when stillness is extended beyond the point where the body can maintain its internal balance without variation. To understand why this signal takes the form of pain, and how the body translates these conditions into sensation, it becomes necessary to look more closely at the systems that interpret physical states and give rise to the experiences we recognize as comfort or discomfort. When the body remains in a seated position for an extended period, the changes that occur are not limited to posture or external alignment. Beneath the surface, the muscles begin to experience a different pattern of activity, one that is quieter, more sustained, and less varied than what they have been shaped to handle over long stretches of time. Muscles are often associated with movement, but they are equally involved in maintaining position. Even when a person appears still, certain muscles remain gently active to support the body against gravity. This activity is usually balanced by variation. Some muscles engage briefly, then release, while others take on the role for a moment. Over time, this creates a rotation that prevents any single group from remaining under constant demand. When sitting becomes prolonged and unchanged, this rotation is reduced. The muscles that help stabilize the spine and maintain the position of the pelvis often remain slightly engaged for longer than usual. They are not contracting with force, but they are not fully releasing either. This state of low-level continuous engagement can be difficult to notice at first. It does not feel like effort in the way lifting or carrying does, but over time, the absence of release becomes significant. Muscles are not only designed to contract, they are also designed to alternate between contraction and relaxation. This alternation allows them to recover, even while remaining active. Without it, the sensation of fatigue can begin to build, not as a sharp signal, but as a gradual heaviness or tension that becomes more defined with time. At the same time, other muscles may become less active than they would be in a more dynamic setting. When the body is supported by a chair, certain stabilizing roles are partially transferred to the structure of the seat. This can reduce the need for some muscles to engage as frequently. Over time, this imbalance between sustained activity in some areas and reduced activity in others may contribute to a feeling that the body is not evenly supported from within. Some regions begin to feel overworked, while others feel less responsive, creating a subtle sense of imbalance that may not be immediately recognized but gradually becomes more noticeable. This pattern of muscle use also influences how tension is experienced across the body. In a dynamic environment, tension is distributed and temporary. It appears, shifts, and resolves as movement continues. When movement is reduced, tension can become more localized. The same areas remain engaged, and the release that would normally follow is delayed. This does not create damage in the short term, but it alters how the body experiences its own state. The posture that once felt neutral begins to feel held, as if the body is maintaining a position rather than resting within it. If we consider how muscles have been used across most of human history, this pattern of sustained, unchanging engagement appears less common. Activities involved variation: walking, lifting, crouching, standing, and even periods of rest included small adjustments that allowed muscles to alternate their roles. The body was rarely placed in a condition where the same muscles remained engaged at the same level for extended periods without interruption. This suggests that the current experience of sitting may introduce a form of muscle activity that is different not in intensity, but in duration and uniformity. The discomfort that arises after sitting for too long may therefore reflect this difference. It is not necessarily the result of excessive effort, but of effort that does not change. Muscles that are designed to participate in a shifting pattern are instead held within a steady one. Over time, this steady pattern becomes less comfortable, not because it is too demanding, but because it lacks the variation that allows the body to maintain balance. This perspective shifts the focus from how much the body is doing to how it is doing it. It suggests that the experience of pain may be linked not only to the presence of activity, but to the absence of change within that activity. To understand how this sustained muscle state is interpreted by the body, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how tension is sensed and how it is translated into the signals that eventually lead to discomfort. As this low-level muscle activity continues, without much variation, the body begins to sense not just the presence of tension, but the persistence of it. Muscles are equipped with sensory systems that monitor how much they are stretched, how strongly they are contracting, and how long these conditions are maintained. These signals are constantly being sent to the nervous system, forming a continuous picture of the body's internal state. Under normal circumstances, this picture is always changing. A muscle contracts briefly, then relaxes. Another takes its place. The signals rise and fall, creating a pattern that the body recognizes as balanced. When sitting becomes prolonged and unchanging, this pattern begins to shift. Instead of fluctuating, certain signals remain steady. The same muscles report similar levels of tension over extended periods, and this constancy becomes a form of information in itself. It suggests that the usual cycle of engagement and release has slowed or paused. The nervous system does not interpret this immediately as a problem, but it does register the difference. Over time, the persistence of these signals begins to stand out against the body's expectation of variation. This is where the sensation of tension can begin to change. At first, it may feel like a mild tightness, something that does not require attention, but as the duration increases, the lack of release becomes more noticeable. The body is not only sensing how much tension is present, but also how long it has remained. This combination, intensity and duration, shapes how the sensation is experienced. A low level of tension, when sustained for long enough, can begin to feel more significant than a brief, stronger contraction that is followed by release. In this way, time becomes part of how the body interprets muscle activity. The longer a condition remains unchanged, the more likely it is to be perceived as something that requires attention. This does not mean that the muscle is being damaged. Rather, it reflects a system that is sensitive to patterns. When the pattern shifts from variation to constancy, the body begins to respond accordingly. Another aspect of this process involves how tension is distributed. In a dynamic state, different muscles share the work of maintaining posture. When variation is reduced, this sharing becomes less balanced. Certain muscles remain more active, while others contribute less. The muscles that stay engaged may begin to experience a gradual buildup of fatigue, not because they are working intensely, but because they are not being relieved. This fatigue is often experienced as a dull, spreading discomfort rather than a sharp sensation. It reflects a condition where the muscle is capable of continuing, but is no longer in an optimal state. At the same time, the muscles that are less active may become less responsive. When a change in position finally occurs, these muscles may take longer to engage, contributing to the feeling that movement is stiff or delayed. This contrast between sustained tension in some areas and reduced responsiveness in others creates a complex sensation that is not always easy to locate. The discomfort may seem to come from a general region rather than a specific point, reinforcing the idea that it is the overall pattern, rather than a single structure, that is being affected. If we consider this within the broader context of human movement, it becomes clear that muscles have long operated within patterns of change. The environment once encouraged a continuous exchange of roles, allowing muscles to engage and release in response to shifting conditions. When this exchange is reduced, the body continues to operate, but with a different internal rhythm, one that is more constant and less varied. The discomfort that arises after sitting for a long time may be one way the body signals that this rhythm has changed. It is not a reaction to intensity, but to persistence. It reflects a system that is attuned not only to how much is happening, but to how long it has been happening without interruption. This understanding suggests that the experience of muscle discomfort during prolonged sitting is not simply a matter of posture, but of how the body interprets sustained conditions. To explore this further, it becomes necessary to look at how these signals of tension interact with other systems, and how they contribute to the overall sensation that is eventually recognized as pain rather than just tightness or fatigue. As this steady pattern of tension continues, the signals coming from the muscles do not remain isolated. They begin to combine with information from other parts of the body, forming a broader picture that the nervous system interprets as a single experience. Muscles report their level of engagement and duration, joints provide information about position and range, and the skin and surrounding tissues contribute details about pressure and contact. Each of these inputs on its own may remain subtle, but when they align over time, when they all reflect a condition that is unchanging, the combined signal becomes more distinct. The body does not experience these signals as separate layers. It gathers them into a unified sensation, one that gradually shifts from neutral awareness into something more noticeable. This process may help explain why the discomfort of prolonged sitting often feels diffuse rather than sharply defined. It is not always possible to point to a single structure and identify it as the source. Instead, the sensation seems to spread across a region, such as the lower back, the hips, or the neck. This spreading quality reflects the integration of multiple signals, each contributing to a general sense that the current state is no longer balanced. The nervous system, rather than isolating each input, presents them as a combined experience that encourages a change in position. At first, this combined signal may still be interpreted as mild discomfort. It can be adjusted with a small movement, a shift in weight, a slight change in posture, and the sensation may ease. But if the underlying conditions remain the same, if the body returns to a similar position and continues without variation, the signals begin to accumulate again. Each cycle adds to the overall pattern, making the sensation more persistent. Over time, the body may begin to respond with a stronger form of communication, one that is less easily ignored. This is where the transition toward what is recognized as pain becomes more likely. Pain, in this context, can be understood as an amplification of earlier signals. It is not a separate event, but a continuation of the same process, expressed at a higher intensity. The nervous system increases the clarity of the message, making it more difficult to remain in the same state without responding. This does not necessarily indicate that damage has occurred. Rather, it reflects the body's attempt to restore variation when earlier signals have not led to change. If we consider how this process might have functioned in earlier human environments, it becomes clearer why such a system would be useful. In conditions where movement was frequent and variation was constant, the early signals would have been enough. A slight discomfort would naturally lead to a shift, because the environment itself encouraged it. The body did not need to escalate its communication, because the response was almost immediate. In modern settings, however, the response is not always immediate. The environment allows the same posture to continue, and attention may remain focused on tasks that do not require movement. In this context, the body's signals may need to become more pronounced in order to produce the same outcome. This escalation is not a failure, but an adaptation of the communication system to a different set of conditions. It ensures that the need for change is eventually recognized, even when earlier cues are overlooked. The experience of pain after sitting for too long may therefore be seen as the result of multiple layers of information being combined and amplified over time. It reflects a process that begins with small, continuous signals and develops into something more noticeable when those signals remain unchanged. The body is not simply reacting to posture, but to a pattern that has persisted beyond what it finds sustainable. This perspective brings the focus back to the role of variation, not as an occasional correction, but as an essential part of how the body maintains comfort. When variation is present, signals remain balanced and distributed. When it is absent, signals begin to align and intensify, eventually forming the sensation that prompts a change. To understand how this process is further influenced by other factors, it becomes necessary to look beyond the muscles and consider how circulation, pressure, and the internal environment of tissues contribute to the overall experience of discomfort during prolonged sitting. Beyond the activity of muscles and the positions of joints, there is another layer of the body that changes quietly during prolonged sitting, one that is less visible but equally important. The body is not only a structure of solid parts, it is also a system of continuous flow. Blood moves through vessels carrying oxygen and nutrients. Other fluids circulate through tissues, supporting their function and maintaining balance at a microscopic level. This movement is not constant in speed or pattern. It is influenced by posture, by muscle activity, and by the subtle shifts that occur when the body changes position. When movement is present, even in small amounts, it creates gentle variations in pressure that help guide these flows. When movement is reduced, these variations become less frequent, and the internal environment begins to reflect a more steady, unchanging state. In a dynamic posture, small adjustments in the body create slight compressions and releases across different areas. Muscles contract and relax, joints shift, and weight is redistributed. These changes act like a quiet assistance to circulation, especially in smaller vessels where movement can help support the passage of blood. The body does not rely solely on large actions to maintain flow. It also depends on these subtle repeated variations that occur as part of normal activity. When sitting becomes prolonged and still, this assistance is reduced. Blood continues to move, guided by the heart and the structure of the sussudi, but the additional influence of movement becomes less active. This does not stop circulation, but it alters the pattern in which it occurs. In areas where pressure remains constant, such as where the body meets the surface of a chair, the flow may become more uniform and less varied. Over time, this can contribute to a sensation of heaviness or dullness, particularly in regions that are bearing weight without change. The tissues in these areas are still receiving what they need, but the dynamic exchange that usually accompanies movement is reduced. This change is subtle and develops gradually, often without clear boundaries. It does not present itself as a sudden problem, but as a slow shift in how the body feels. A similar pattern can be observed in how fluids move within and around tissues. These fluids help maintain the internal environment of cells, allowing them to function within a stable range. Movement encourages this exchange by creating slight differences in pressure that help fluids shift from one area to another. When the body remains in a fixed position, these differences become less pronounced. The exchange continues, but with less variation. Over time, this may contribute to a sense that the tissues are less responsive, as if they are existing within a more constant state rather than a changing one. From the perspective of human history, it is likely that these internal flows were rarely separated from movement for long periods. The body was almost always engaged in some form of activity or adjustment, and this activity supported the continuous variation of internal conditions. The modern experience of sitting introduces a situation where movement is reduced while time continues to pass. The internal systems continue to function, but with a different pattern, one that is more stable and less varied than before. The discomfort that arises after sitting for too long may therefore be influenced not only by muscles and joints, but by these changes in internal flow. It reflects a body that is maintaining itself in a more constant condition than it has historically experienced. This condition is not immediately harmful, but it differs from the patterns the body has long been shaped to expect. The signals that emerge from this difference, whether they are described as heaviness, stiffness, or a dull ache, may be part of the body's way of indicating that variation has been reduced for longer than it prefers. To understand how these changes in flow contribute to the sensation of pain, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how pressure and circulation interact with the nervous system, and how these internal conditions are translated into the experiences we recognize as comfort or discomfort over time. When this internal flow becomes more uniform and less influenced by movement, the role of pressure begins to stand out more clearly. The body is always in contact with surfaces, and wherever contact occurs, pressure is created. In a dynamic state, this pressure shifts constantly. A slight adjustment in posture redistributes weight, relieving one area while increasing load in another. Over time, this creates a pattern where no single region remains under continuous compression. The tissues experience variation, and this variation allows them to maintain balance without drawing attention to any one point. When sitting becomes prolonged and unchanged, this pattern is altered. The areas of contact between the body and the chair remain consistent, and the pressure applied to these regions becomes steady rather than shifting. The body continues to tolerate this pressure, but the absence of change begins to influence how it is experienced. Tissues that are designed to share load over time are instead placed in a condition where the load remains concentrated. This concentration does not immediately create pain, but it changes the internal environment in a gradual way. Cells within these regions continue to function, but they do so under more constant conditions. The slight variations that would normally occur, changes in compression, brief moments of relief, are reduced. Over time, this can contribute to a sense that the area is becoming less responsive, as if it is settling into a state that is more fixed than usual. At the same time, the interaction between pressure and circulation becomes more noticeable. In areas where pressure is sustained, the movement of blood and other fluids continues, but it may do so with less variation. The tissues are not deprived of what they need, but the dynamic exchange that usually accompanies shifting pressure is reduced. This can lead to a sensation that is often described as dull or heavy, rather than sharp. It reflects a condition where the body is maintaining function, but without the subtle changes that help distribute load and support responsiveness. The nervous system receives information from these areas continuously. It monitors not only how much pressure is present, but also how long it has remained. When pressure is brief and followed by relief, it is often interpreted as part of normal variation. When it becomes sustained, the interpretation begins to change. The duration of pressure becomes part of the signal, contributing to the overall sensation that is being formed. This is similar to how muscles respond to sustained tension. It is not only the intensity of the condition, but its persistence that shapes how it is experienced. Over time, the combination of sustained pressure and reduced variation in flow begins to form a more coherent signal. The body does not isolate pressure as a separate sensation. It integrates it with information from muscles, joints, and internal circulation. The result is a gradual shift from neutrality toward discomfort. This discomfort may not be tied to a single point, but to a region where these conditions overlap. It reflects a pattern where the body has remained in contact with the same surfaces, under the same conditions, for longer than it is accustomed to. If we consider how this might have been different in earlier human environments, the contrast becomes clearer. The ground was uneven, and even a small change in position would alter how pressure was distributed. Surfaces did not match the shape of the body perfectly, encouraging continuous adjustment. These adjustments ensured that pressure was rarely constant for long. The body did not need to tolerate prolonged compression in a single area, because the environment itself encouraged redistribution. In modern settings, the chair provides a consistent surface that supports the body in a predictable way. This consistency allows pressure to remain in the same regions without interruption. While this can feel comfortable at first, it also creates the conditions for pressure to become a more persistent factor over time. The discomfort that arises after sitting for too long may therefore be influenced by this sustained interaction between the body and the surface. It is not simply the presence of pressure, but the absence of change within that pressure that shapes the experience. This perspective suggests that the body is sensitive not only to how much load it carries, but to how that load is distributed across time. When distribution is dynamic, the body remains at ease. When it becomes fixed, the signals begin to change. To understand how these signals evolve into the clearer sensation of pain, it becomes necessary to look at how the nervous system integrates information from pressure, flow, and muscle activity, and how it decides when a condition has persisted long enough to require a stronger response. As these conditions of steady pressure and reduced variation in flow continue, the signals they produce do not remain separate. They begin to converge, forming a pattern that the nervous system interprets as a unified state rather than a collection of individual inputs. Pressure from contact surfaces, the quieter movement of fluids, and the sustained activity of certain muscles all contribute to this pattern. Each signal carries information about intensity and duration, but it is the consistency across these signals that becomes most significant. When multiple systems report similar conditions over time, unchanging pressure, limited movement, steady tension, the body begins to recognize not just what is happening, but that it has been happening for longer than expected. This recognition does not occur in a single moment. It develops gradually as the nervous system continues to receive similar input without interruption. At first, the signals may be interpreted as part of a neutral state. The body remains supported, and there is no immediate need to respond. But as the pattern persists, the lack of variation becomes more prominent. The nervous system is sensitive not only to extremes, but also to uniformity. When change is absent, the constancy itself becomes meaningful. It suggests that the usual adjustments that maintain balance are not occurring. Over time, this can lead to a shift in how the signals are interpreted. What was once neutral begins to feel less comfortable, not because the intensity has increased significantly, but because the duration has extended without change. This shift may help explain why the discomfort of prolonged sitting often appears gradually and without a clear starting point. It does not arise from a single event, but from the accumulation of conditions that remain the same. The body, in response, begins to translate this accumulation into a sensation that encourages change. This translation is not abrupt. It moves through stages, from a vague sense of unease to a more defined discomfort. The sensation may spread across a region, reflecting the integration of signals from multiple sources. It may feel dull, persistent, or difficult to localize, because it represents a pattern rather than a single point of strain. As the pattern continues, the nervous system may increase the clarity of the signal. This is where the sensation begins to resemble what is commonly described as pain. Pain, in this context, is not necessarily a marker of damage, but a signal that has become more pronounced in order to prompt a response. It reflects a state that has persisted beyond what the body finds sustainable, and it serves to draw attention to the need for change. The transition from subtle discomfort to clearer pain is therefore not a sudden shift, but a continuation of the same process. The body amplifies its communication when earlier signals have not led to adjustment. If we consider how this system might have functioned in earlier human environments, the need for such amplification may have been less frequent. Variation in movement and posture would have occurred naturally, and early signals would have been enough to maintain balance. The body did not need to escalate its response, because the environment itself encouraged change. In modern settings, where the environment allows stillness to continue, the nervous system adapts by strengthening its signals. Pain becomes more likely, not because the body is failing, but because the conditions it encounters differ from those it has long been shaped to expect. This perspective highlights the role of integration within the body's response. It is not a single factor, pressure, flow, or muscle activity that leads to discomfort, but the alignment of these factors over time. When they converge in a pattern of uniformity, the body interprets this as a state that requires adjustment. The sensation that emerges is the result of this interpretation, shaped by both the intensity and the duration of the signals involved. Understanding this process invites a broader view of how the body communicates. It suggests that pain is not an isolated event, but the culmination of a sequence that begins with subtle changes and builds as those changes persist. To explore this further, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how the nervous system determines when to amplify these signals and what factors influence the point at which discomfort becomes strong enough to demand attention. Long before chairs, controlled environments, or extended periods of stillness, the human body had already developed a way to interpret its internal state through sensation. Among these sensations, pain occupies a particular place. It is often understood as something to avoid, a sign that something has gone wrong. But in a broader biological sense, pain can be seen as part of a communication system, one that has evolved not only to signal injury, but also to indicate when conditions are moving away from what the body can sustain over time. This system does not rely on a single trigger. It integrates information from many sources, gradually shaping how the body becomes aware of itself. In earlier human environments, where movement and variation were constant, the signals leading to pain may have been less frequently required to reach higher intensity. The body was continuously adjusting, responding to uneven ground, changing conditions, and the need to remain attentive. Small imbalances were often corrected quickly, not through conscious effort but through the natural interaction between the body and its surroundings. In such conditions, the communication system could remain subtle. A slight discomfort would lead to a shift, and the signal would fade. Pain, in its more noticeable form, would emerge primarily in response to more significant changes, injury, excessive strain, or situations that required immediate attention. In this way, pain functioned as a clear but relatively rare signal within a broader spectrum of sensation. As environments became more stable and allowed for prolonged stillness, the context in which this system operates began to change. The body continues to monitor pressure, tension, and movement, but the patterns it encounters are different. Instead of constant variation, it may experience extended periods of uniformity. The early signals that once led to quick adjustments may no longer produce immediate responses. The body remains in the same position, and the conditions it monitors remain unchanged. Over time, this alters how the communication system functions. Signals that were once sufficient at a low intensity may need to become more pronounced in order to achieve the same outcome. This does not mean that pain itself has changed in its fundamental nature. Rather, the conditions under which it arises have shifted. The body is still using the same system, but it is applying it within a different context. When subtle signals do not lead to movement, the system adapts by increasing the clarity of its message. Pain becomes more likely, not as a sign of failure, but as a continuation of a process that is attempting to restore balance. This perspective suggests that pain is not only a reaction to extreme conditions, but also a response to prolonged ones. It reflects a sensitivity to patterns over time, rather than to isolated events. When the body experiences conditions that remain unchanged beyond what it expects, the communication system gradually intensifies its signals. The goal is not to produce discomfort for its own sake, but to encourage a change that reintroduces variation. If we consider this within the broader history of human movement, it becomes clearer why such a system would be useful. In environments where change was constant, the ability to detect subtle imbalances and respond to them quickly would help maintain function and avoid more serious problems. Pain as a stronger signal would serve as a safeguard when earlier cues were not enough. In modern settings where stillness can be maintained without interruption, this safeguard may be activated more often. The body continues to rely on the same sequence, subtle signals followed by stronger ones, but the conditions that trigger this sequence have become more common. The discomfort felt after sitting for too long may therefore be understood as part of this broader system. It is not simply a reaction to posture, but a response to a pattern that has persisted without change. Pain, in this context, becomes a signal that the body's expectations of variation have not been met. To understand how this signal is shaped, why it feels the way it does, and why it appears in certain areas, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how the nervous system processes and organizes these inputs into the experience that is recognized as pain. When the body gathers signals from muscles, joints, pressure, and internal flow, these signals do not travel directly into awareness in their original form. they are first processed within the nervous system, where they are compared, filtered, and shaped into a single experience. This process is not simply a transfer of information, it is an interpretation, one that depends on patterns rather than isolated inputs. The nervous system does not ask only what is happening in one place, but how different parts of the body are reporting their state over time. When these reports show variation, the overall interpretation tends to remain neutral. When they begin to align in a pattern of constancy, the interpretation gradually shifts. This shaping of sensation helps explain why the experience of discomfort is not always proportional to a single physical factor. A small amount of pressure, a low level of muscle tension, or a limited range of joint movement may not be significant on their own, but when they occur together, and when they persist without change, the nervous system begins to treat them as a unified condition. It is the pattern, the combination, and duration that becomes meaningful. Over time, this pattern is translated into a sensation that is more noticeable, more difficult to ignore, and more likely to lead to a change in behavior. The way this translation occurs is not fixed. It can vary depending on context, attention, and prior experience. The nervous system is not only responding to physical signals, but also to how those signals fit within a broader understanding of the body's state. If a pattern has been encountered before and resolved through movement, the system may be more likely to interpret it as something that requires action. If the same pattern continues without change, the intensity of the sensation may increase, not because the physical condition has worsened significantly, but because the interpretation has shifted. This process suggests that pain is not simply a direct measure of physical strain. It is a constructed experience, one that emerges from the integration of multiple signals over time. The body is not presenting raw data, but a summary that reflects both the current state and the persistence of that state. In the context of prolonged sitting, this summary often takes the form of a dull, spreading discomfort that gradually becomes more defined. It reflects the convergence of steady pressure, sustained muscle activity, and reduced variation in movement, all interpreted as a single condition that has continued longer than expected. If we consider how this system might have functioned in earlier environments, it becomes easier to see why it is organized around patterns. The body would have been exposed to constant change, and the nervous system would have learned to interpret variation as normal. When conditions deviated from this pattern, when pressure remained in one place, or when movement was restricted, the system would begin to signal that something was different. In most cases, this difference would be brief, and the body would respond by adjusting position. The signal would fade, and balance would be restored. In modern settings, where the same posture can be maintained for long periods, the difference becomes more prolonged. The nervous system continues to interpret the pattern as unusual, but the expected response movement may not occur immediately. As a result, the interpretation becomes stronger. The sensation becomes clearer, more persistent, and eventually more difficult to ignore. Pain, in this context, is not a separate event, but the result of an ongoing process of interpretation. It is shaped by how the nervous system integrates signals and how it evaluates the persistence of a condition over time. This understanding helps explain why the discomfort of sitting does not always follow a predictable path. It can vary from one person to another, from one moment to the next, depending on how the pattern of signals is formed and interpreted. It also suggests that the body is not reacting to a single cause, but to a broader pattern that has developed gradually. To explore this further, it becomes necessary to consider how attention and awareness influence this process, and how the way a person engages with these sensations may shape the experience of discomfort as it unfolds. As the nervous system shapes these signals into a unified experience, another element begins to influence how that experience is felt: attention. The body is constantly generating information, but not all of it reaches awareness with the same clarity. Many signals remain in the background, forming a quiet layer of sensation that does not interrupt thought. Others move forward, becoming more noticeable, more defined. This shift is not determined only by the strength of the signal. It is also shaped by whether attention is directed toward it or away from it. In the context of prolonged sitting, this creates an interesting pattern. At the beginning, the signals that arise from steady pressure and sustained muscle activity are often subtle. They exist beneath the surface of awareness, allowing attention to remain focused on tasks, conversations, or other forms of engagement. The body begins to register the lack of variation, but the experience does not yet become prominent. As time passes, however, the persistence of these signals begins to change how they are processed. Even if attention remains elsewhere, the consistency of the input makes it more likely that the nervous system will bring it forward. The sensation becomes clearer, not because it has suddenly intensified, but because it has remained present without interruption. When attention finally shifts toward the body, perhaps during a pause, or when the task ends, the accumulated signals can appear all at once. The discomfort may feel as though it has emerged suddenly, even though it has been developing gradually. This can create the impression that the body has changed in a moment, when in fact the change has been unfolding over time. The role of attention helps explain why the experience of discomfort can vary so widely. In situations where attention is deeply engaged, the body's signals may remain in the background for longer, even as they accumulate. In quieter moments, or when attention is more open, the same signals may become noticeable sooner. This does not mean that attention creates the sensation, but that it influences when and how the sensation is experienced. The nervous system continues to integrate signals regardless of attention, but awareness determines when those signals become part of conscious experience. This interaction between signal and attention may have functioned differently in earlier human environments, when the surroundings required continuous awareness of movement, sound, or potential changes. The body's signals were part of a broader field of attention. Small discomforts would be noticed within a context that encouraged immediate adjustment. The need to move was not separate from the environment, it was embedded within it. In modern settings, attention is often directed toward activities that do not involve the body's immediate state. The environment allows the body to remain still while the mind is engaged elsewhere. This separation can delay the moment when signals are brought into awareness. By the time they are noticed, they may have already developed into a more persistent form. Pain, in this context, can be seen as a signal that has reached a level where it can no longer remain in the background. It moves forward into awareness, drawing attention to a condition that has been present for some time. This does not necessarily indicate that the condition has suddenly worsened. It reflects a process in which signals have accumulated and have become significant enough to require focus. The experience of pain is therefore shaped not only by the physical state of the body, but also by when and how that state enters awareness. This perspective adds another layer to the understanding of discomfort during prolonged sitting. It suggests that the body is not only responding to sustained conditions, but also navigating how those conditions are perceived. The timing of awareness, the direction of attention, and the persistence of signals all contribute to the final experience. The discomfort that seems to appear suddenly may, in fact, be the result of a long sequence that has only now become visible. To continue exploring this process, it becomes necessary to look beyond the nervous system alone and consider how the structure of the modern environment shapes both the body's signals and the way attention is directed, influencing how and when discomfort is ultimately felt. When the body's signals depend not only on physical conditions but also on how those conditions are allowed to persist, the role of the surrounding environment becomes more central. The modern environment is not simply a backdrop where sitting occurs. It actively shapes how long the body remains in one position, how often movement is interrupted, and how attention is directed away from physical sensations. In earlier human settings, the environment itself created variation. Uneven ground, shifting light, changes in temperature, and the presence of sound or movement all encouraged the body to adjust continuously. Stillness was possible, but it was rarely sustained without interruption. The body remained in a quiet dialogue with its surroundings, responding in small ways that maintained balance without requiring conscious effort. In contrast, many modern environments are designed to reduce this need for response. Surfaces are flat and stable, temperature is controlled, lighting remains constant, tasks are structured in ways that allow attention to remain fixed for extended periods. Within this setting, the body is no longer prompted by external variation. It can remain in a single posture without interruption, and the usual cues that would lead to movement are diminished. This does not force the body to remain still, but it allows stillness to continue far longer than it once did. The chair, the desk, and the surrounding space work together to create a condition where movement is optional rather than necessary. This shift introduces a subtle but important change. In environments that encourage variation, The body moves in response to what is happening around it. Movement is not something that needs to be remembered or scheduled. It occurs naturally, guided by the changing conditions of the environment. In more controlled settings, this guidance is reduced. The body may continue to produce internal signals that encourage movement, but these signals are no longer reinforced by the surroundings. As a result, the decision to move becomes more dependent on conscious awareness rather than on immediate necessity. Over time, this can lead to longer periods where the body remains in one position, even as subtle signals begin to emerge. Another aspect of the modern environment is how it organizes time. Activities are often structured into continuous periods that prioritize focus and completion. These periods can extend without natural breaks, allowing the body to remain seated while attention remains directed toward a task. In earlier conditions, interruptions were more common. Changes in the environment, the need to respond to external events, or the limits of natural light would create pauses that encouraged movement. These pauses were not designed for the body, but they had the effect of reintroducing variation. In modern settings, the absence of these interruptions allows time and stillness to align, creating longer stretches where the body experiences the same conditions without change. This alignment does not immediately produce discomfort, but it creates the conditions in which discomfort can gradually develop. The body continues to monitor its internal state, and as signals persist, they begin to accumulate. Without external prompts to interrupt this process, the accumulation can reach a point where the sensation becomes more noticeable. The discomfort that arises is therefore not only a result of posture or duration, but also of the environment that allows both to persist together. If we consider this from a broader perspective, the modern environment can be seen as amplifying certain patterns that were once limited by natural variation. It extends the duration of stillness, reduces the need for adjustment, and separates attention from the body's immediate state. The body, shaped by a history of continuous interaction with changing surroundings, continues to operate according to those patterns. When the environment no longer provides the variation it expects, the body's internal signals become more important, and eventually more pronounced. This perspective suggests that the discomfort associated with sitting is not solely an internal issue, but part of a relationship between the body and its environment. The signals that arise reflect not only what is happening within the body, but also how the environment has been structured to allow certain conditions to continue. To understand this relationship more fully, it becomes necessary to look at how different environments, both past and present, shape the patterns of movement and stillness that the body experiences over time. If the modern environment reduces the need for movement, it also begins to shape how the body interprets what is normal. Over time, repeated exposure to long periods of sitting can quietly redefine the baseline of experience. What once might have felt unusual, a prolonged stillness, a fixed posture, a steady pressure, gradually becomes familiar. The body does not immediately reject this shift. It adapts, to a degree, by learning to operate within these new patterns. But this adaptation is not complete in the sense of replacing older expectations. Instead, it exists alongside them. The body continues to carry its long history of variation while also becoming accustomed to conditions of stability. This creates a subtle tension between what the body has learned over time and what it is now asked to do repeatedly. At first, this tension is not obvious. The experience of sitting may feel neutral or even comfortable, especially when it is brief. The environment supports the body, and the absence of movement does not immediately lead to discomfort. But as the duration increases, the older patterns begin to reassert themselves. The body's expectation of variation formed over many generations does not disappear. It remains active beneath the surface, influencing how signals are interpreted. When variation is absent for too long, this expectation begins to express itself through subtle sensations that gradually become more noticeable. This dual-state adaptation to stillness, combined with an underlying expectation of movement, may help explain why discomfort can feel both familiar and unexpected at the same time. A person may sit for long periods regularly, and yet the discomfort that appears does not feel entirely predictable. It can vary from day to day, from one context to another, even when the posture appears similar. This variability reflects the interaction between two patterns: the newer habit of prolonged sitting and the older tendency toward continuous adjustment. The body is navigating both at once, and the signals that emerge are shaped by this interaction. Another aspect of this process involves how the body recalibrates its sense of normal over time. When a certain pattern is repeated frequently, the nervous system may begin to treat it as expected, even if it differs from earlier conditions. This does not eliminate discomfort, but it can delay the point at which signals become noticeable. The body may tolerate longer periods of stillness before responding, not because the underlying processes have changed, but because the interpretation of those processes has shifted slightly. When discomfort does appear, it may seem to arrive later, but it can also feel more pronounced, as if the accumulated signals have reached a point where they can no longer remain in the background. This recalibration does not occur in isolation. It is influenced by the consistency of the environment, the repetition of daily routines, and the way attention is directed. When the same patterns are experienced repeatedly, the body adjusts its expectations, but it does not fully replace the need for variation. Instead, it creates a layered response, where adaptation and underlying preference coexist. The discomfort that arises after sitting for too long may therefore reflect not only the current state of the body, but also the tension between these layers. From a broader perspective, this suggests that the experience of pain is not fixed, but dynamic. It evolves as the body interacts with its environment over time. The same posture can be experienced differently depending on how often it is repeated, how long it is maintained, and how it fits within the body's accumulated patterns. The modern environment, by encouraging prolonged stillness, plays a role in shaping these patterns, but it does not fully override the body's deeper tendencies. This creates a situation where the body continues to signal a need for variation, even as it becomes more accustomed to stability. The signals may shift in timing and intensity, but their underlying purpose remains the same. They reflect a system that has not fully separated from its history of movement, even as it adapts to new conditions. To explore this further, it becomes necessary to consider how these patterns differ across individuals and across generations, and how the experience of sitting and discomfort may change as the environment continues to evolve. As these patterns of adaptation and expectation continue to interact, differences begin to appear not only within a single individual over time, but also across groups of people who grow up in different environments. The experience of sitting, and the discomfort that may follow it, is not identical for everyone. It is shaped by how often the body has been exposed to prolonged stillness, how early this exposure begins, and how the surrounding environment either reinforces or interrupts it. This variation does not suggest that the body changes quickly at a biological level, but that its patterns of response are influenced by repeated experience. For individuals who spend much of their time in environments that encourage movement, where positions change frequently and stillness is interrupted, the body continues to operate within a familiar pattern of variation. Signals that arise during periods of sitting may appear sooner, not because the body is less capable, but because the contrast between movement and stillness is more pronounced. The body recognizes the absence of change more quickly and responds accordingly. In contrast, for those who grow up in environments where sitting is a common and sustained part of daily life, the body may become more accustomed to longer periods of uniformity. The signals that indicate a need for movement may take longer to reach awareness, as the nervous system adjusts to the repeated pattern of stillness. This adjustment does not remove the underlying processes that lead to discomfort, but it can alter their timing and intensity. The body continues to monitor pressure, tension, and flow, but the interpretation of these signals may be slightly delayed, allowing stillness to persist for longer before discomfort becomes noticeable. Across generations, this pattern can become even more layered. As environments remain consistent over time, each generation is exposed to similar conditions from an earlier stage. The body's basic structure does not change significantly within such a short timescale, but the patterns of experience do. Children who spend more time in seated activities may develop a different sense of what feels normal, even though the underlying systems of the body remain aligned with a history of movement. This creates a situation where the expectation of variation is still present, but it is expressed within a context that encourages stability. The result is not a complete adaptation, but a coexistence of patterns that can produce subtle differences in how discomfort is experienced. This variation can also be influenced by the diversity of daily activities. A person who alternates between sitting and movement may experience the signals of discomfort differently from someone who remains seated for longer, uninterrupted periods. The body responds not only to posture, but to the sequence of conditions it encounters throughout the day. Periods of movement can reintroduce variation, altering the pattern of signals and delaying the buildup of discomfort. Periods of continuous sitting allow the pattern of uniformity to develop more fully, increasing the likelihood that signals will become more pronounced. From this perspective, the experience of pain after sitting for too long is not a fixed outcome, but a response that emerges from a combination of factors: environment, repetition, attention, and the body's long-standing tendencies. It reflects a system that is flexible in how it responds, even as it remains rooted in patterns shaped over much longer periods of time. The modern environment does not create a single, uniform experience, but a range of possibilities, each influenced by how the body interacts with its surroundings. This understanding highlights the importance of looking beyond a single posture or behavior and considering the broader patterns that shape how the body feels. It suggests that discomfort is not only about what is happening in the moment, but about how that moment fits within a larger sequence of experiences. The body is continuously integrating these experiences, adjusting its responses, and maintaining a dialogue between past tendencies and present conditions. To continue this exploration, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how these patterns are reflected in physical evidence from earlier human populations, and how the ways in which they rested and moved may offer insight into the conditions under which the body developed its expectations of variation. If the body carries patterns shaped over long periods of human history, then some of those patterns may leave traces that can still be observed. Although soft tissues like muscles and circulation do not preserve easily over time, the structures of the skeleton can offer indirect insight into how the body was used. Bones respond slowly to repeated forces. Over many years, the way a person moves, rests, and distributes weight can influence the shape and density of certain areas. These changes are not precise records of daily behavior, but they can suggest general patterns whether the body experienced a wide range of movement or remained within more limited positions. When examining skeletal remains from earlier human populations, researchers often find signs that indicate frequent variation in posture and activity. The joints, particularly in the hips, knees, and spine, often show patterns consistent with movement across different positions rather than prolonged fixation in one. This does not mean that early humans were constantly active in an intense way, but that their bodies were exposed to a broader range of positions over time. Squatting, kneeling, walking, and shifting weight across uneven ground would have created a distribution of forces that changed regularly. The skeleton, adapting gradually to these conditions, reflects a history of variation rather than uniformity. In contrast, more recent populations, especially those living in environments where sitting on chairs became common, sometimes show different patterns. The range of movement recorded in joint surfaces may appear more limited, and certain areas may reflect more consistent loading over time. These observations do not suggest a sudden transformation, but a gradual shift in how the body is used within daily life. The introduction of stable seating, along with environments that allow prolonged stillness, creates conditions where certain positions are repeated more often and for longer durations. Over time, this repetition may leave subtle traces in the structure of the body. It is important to approach these interpretations with care. Skeletal evidence does not provide a complete picture, and it cannot capture the full complexity of movement or rest. Many factors influence bone structure, including age, activity, and environment. However, when considered alongside what is known about human behavior and environments, these traces can help illustrate a broader pattern. They suggest that the human body has long existed within a context of variation, where no single posture dominated for extended periods. This perspective aligns with the idea that discomfort during prolonged sitting may be connected to a difference between past and present patterns. The body, shaped by a history of diverse movement, encounters a modern environment where certain positions can be maintained without interruption. The signals that arise, whether subtle or more pronounced, may reflect this difference, rather than a simple reaction to a single posture. From a broader viewpoint, these skeletal traces serve as a quiet record of how the body has been used across time. They do not provide direct answers, but they offer a context in which current experiences can be understood. The discomfort felt after sitting for too long may be part of a larger story, one that connects the present moment to patterns that have developed over many generations. It reflects a body that continues to respond according to long-established tendencies, even as the environment in which it exists has changed. To deepen this understanding, it becomes necessary to look beyond the physical traces and consider how daily patterns of movement and rest in earlier human societies may have differed from those seen today, and how these patterns shape the conditions under which the body developed its sense of balance. If skeletal traces suggest a history of varied movement, then daily life in earlier human societies likely reflected this variation in more direct ways. Rest, in such contexts, was not separated from the surrounding environment. It occurred within landscapes that were uneven, open, and constantly changing. A person might pause during the day, but the way they rested was shaped by what was available around them. The ground might be firm in one place and softer in another. Surfaces might slope, shift, or respond slightly under weight. These conditions did not allow the body to settle into a single, unchanging position for long. Even when still, the body remained in quiet dialogue with the environment, making small adjustments that maintained balance without drawing attention. Sitting, in the sense of lowering the body toward the ground, certainly existed, but it did not resemble the fixed posture created by a chair. The body might rest in a squat, with the weight supported through the legs and feet, requiring continuous subtle engagement to maintain stability. It might lean against a surface, where the contact point would change as the body shifted slightly. It might sit on the ground with legs positioned in different ways, each arrangement encouraging a different distribution of weight. These positions were not rigid. They allowed for movement, even if that movement was minimal. The body could transition between them easily, responding to comfort, to the need for awareness, or simply to the natural tendency to adjust over time. This pattern of rest suggests that stillness was rarely absolute. Even when a person was not actively moving through space, the body continued to shift within its position. These shifts did not require conscious decision. They were part of how the body interacted with a variable environment. Over time, this interaction may have reinforced a pattern in which rest included continuous, low-level change. The body did not expect to remain fixed, and it did not need to rely on strong signals to prompt movement. The environment itself provided enough variation to guide these adjustments. In contrast, modern environments often separate rest from variation. Surfaces are designed to match the shape of the body and to remain stable. The chair holds the body in a predictable position, reducing the need for adjustment. The surrounding space does not change in ways that require response. As a result, the body can remain in one posture without interruption, and the small shifts that once occurred naturally may become less frequent. This does not mean that movement disappears entirely, but that it is no longer supported by the environment in the same way. The body must rely more on internal signals to initiate change, and these signals take time to develop. The difference between these patterns, rest within variation and rest within stability, may be central to understanding why prolonged sitting leads to discomfort. In earlier conditions, the body experienced rest as a dynamic state where movement and stillness were not separate but intertwined. In modern settings, rest can become more static, defined by the absence of movement rather than by its subtle presence. The body, shaped by the former pattern, continues to expect variation even when it is no longer provided. The discomfort that arises after sitting for too long may therefore reflect not only the posture itself, but the absence of the environmental cues that once guided continuous adjustment. This perspective shifts the focus from individual behavior to the relationship between the body and its surroundings. It suggests that the way rest is experienced is influenced as much by the environment as by the body itself. When the environment encourages variation, the body maintains balance with minimal effort. When it allows stillness to persist, the body must rely on internal signals to restore that balance, and these signals may gradually become more pronounced. To explore this relationship further, it becomes necessary to consider how the organization of space and daily life in the modern world continues to shape these patterns, and how the absence of variation extends beyond posture into the broader structure of time and activity. If rest in earlier human environments was shaped by constant variation, then the pattern of daily life itself may have reinforced this condition in ways that are easy to overlook. Movement was not confined to specific moments set aside for activity. It was distributed across the entire day, woven into tasks, transitions, and the simple act of being present within a changing environment. A person might walk for a period, then pause, then shift position while resting, then move again in response to new conditions. These changes did not follow a rigid schedule. They emerged from the interaction between the body and its surroundings, creating a rhythm in which no single state persisted for too long. This rhythm did not require conscious management. It was maintained by the nature of the environment itself. In such a context, the body would rarely experience long stretches of uniformity. Even when a person remained in one place, the position they occupied would change subtly over time. The ground beneath them might require adjustment, or the need to remain aware of the environment might encourage small shifts in posture. These variations ensured that the body's internal systems, muscles, joints, circulation continued to operate within a dynamic pattern. The signals that arise from these systems would fluctuate naturally, preventing the accumulation of consistent conditions that might lead to discomfort. The body did not need to generate strong signals to prompt movement, because movement was already embedded within the flow of daily life. When this pattern is compared to modern routines, a different structure begins to appear. Activities are often organized into extended periods that emphasize continuity. A person may remain seated for a long duration while focusing on a task that does not require physical change. The environment supports this continuity, providing stable surfaces and predictable conditions. Movement, rather than being distributed across time, becomes concentrated into specific moments before or after periods of stillness, or in designated intervals. Between these moments, the body may remain in a relatively fixed state for longer than it would have in earlier contexts. This shift does not remove movement from daily life, but it changes how movement is arranged. Instead of being continuous and varied, it becomes segmented. Periods of activity are separated from periods of stillness, and the transition between them may involve more noticeable adjustments. The body moves from a state of relative inactivity to one of greater activity, rather than maintaining a constant background of subtle change. This segmentation can influence how the body experiences both states. Stillness may feel more static, and movement may feel more abrupt, because the gradual transitions that once connected them are less present. The discomfort associated with prolonged sitting may therefore reflect not only the duration of stillness, but the way in which stillness is separated from movement within the structure of the day. When variation is continuous, the body remains within a range of conditions that it can sustain with ease. When variation is interrupted for long periods, the body begins to experience a narrower set of conditions, and the signals that arise from this narrowing become more pronounced. From this perspective, the experience of pain after sitting for too long is connected to a broader pattern in how time and activity are organized. It is not simply the result of a single posture, but of a sequence in which that posture is maintained without the variation that once accompanied it. The body, shaped by a history of distributed movement, continues to respond according to that pattern. When the pattern is altered, the signals it produces begin to change. This suggests that the relationship between movement and stillness is not defined only by how much of each occurs, but by how they are arranged across time. The body appears to respond differently when movement is continuous and integrated, compared to when it is separated and intermittent. The discomfort that emerges may be one way this difference becomes visible. To understand how these patterns influence the experience of modern individuals more directly, it becomes necessary to look at how current lifestyles shape the balance between movement and stillness across generations, and how this balance continues to evolve within changing environments. When movement becomes separated from stillness, the way the body experiences an entire day begins to change in subtle but important ways. Instead of existing within a continuous flow of small adjustments, the body alternates between longer periods of relative inactivity and shorter periods of more noticeable movement. This shift does not necessarily reduce the total amount of movement a person experiences, but it changes how that movement is distributed. The body is no longer guided by a steady background of variation. Instead, it moves between distinct states, each with its own pattern of signals and sensations. During extended periods of sitting, the body enters a condition where variation is reduced, and uniformity becomes more prominent. Muscles maintain low-level activity without frequent release. Pressure remains in consistent areas, and internal flows become more stable. These conditions develop gradually, often without immediate awareness. When the body eventually transitions out of this state, when a person stands, walks, or stretches, the change can feel more pronounced than it would in a more continuous pattern of movement. The joints begin to move through a wider range. Muscles that have been less active are re-engaged, and areas that have been under steady pressure experience a shift in load. This transition is not always smooth. It can be accompanied by sensations of stiffness, tightness, or a temporary resistance to movement. These sensations are often brief, but they reflect the contrast between the two states rather than a problem within either one alone. If movement were distributed more evenly across time, this contrast might be less noticeable. The body would remain within a narrower range of conditions, adjusting continuously rather than shifting between extremes. The modern pattern of segmentation, however, creates clearer boundaries between stillness and movement. The body spends longer in one state, then moves more distinctly into another. This can influence how both states are experienced. Stillness may feel more static and eventually less comfortable, while movement may feel more necessary, even if it is brief. Over time, this pattern can shape expectations within the body. The nervous system begins to recognize the sequence stillness followed by movement, and may adjust how it interprets signals within each phase. During periods of sitting, signals may accumulate more gradually, reaching a point where they prompt a transition. During movement, these signals may dissipate more quickly as variation is reintroduced. The cycle repeats, creating a rhythm that is different from the continuous variation that characterized earlier human environments. This rhythm is not inherently problematic, but it introduces a different set of conditions for the body to manage. The discomfort that arises after sitting for too long may therefore be part of this cycle. It reflects the accumulation of signals during a period of reduced variation, followed by a transition that restores balance. The intensity and timing of these signals can vary depending on how long each phase lasts and how the transition occurs. If the period of stillness is extended, the accumulation becomes more pronounced. If movement is reintroduced earlier, the signals may remain subtle and less noticeable. From a broader perspective, this pattern suggests that the body is responsive not only to individual positions, but to sequences of conditions over time. It is influenced by how long each state is maintained and how smoothly transitions occur between them. The modern organization of daily life, by separating movement and stillness into distinct segments, creates a pattern that differs from the continuous variation of earlier environments. The body continues to adapt to this pattern, but it does so while carrying expectations shaped by a different history. The signals it produces, whether subtle or more pronounced, reflect this ongoing interaction. They are not simply reactions to a single moment, but part of a sequence that unfolds across time. To understand how this sequence varies among individuals and how it may change across different stages of life, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how the balance between movement and stillness is experienced within different populations and age groups, and how these differences influence the sensations that arise during prolonged sitting. The way this cycle of stillness and movement is experienced can differ depending on how the body has been shaped by repeated patterns over time. Not all bodies respond in exactly the same way to prolonged sitting, even when the posture appears similar. The differences are not only a matter of strength or flexibility, but of how the body has learned to distribute activity, how it interprets sustained conditions, and how quickly it transitions between states. These patterns are influenced by daily routines, by the variety of movement a person experiences, and by how early in life these routines begin to form. For individuals whose days include frequent changes in position, the body remains familiar with variation. Even when sitting occurs, it is often interrupted by small movements or transitions that prevent uniformity from persisting for long. In such cases, the signals that arise during sitting may remain subtle, because the body does not remain in one condition long enough for them to accumulate significantly. When movement resumes, the transition is smoother, as the body has not moved far from its usual range of variation. The difference between states is present, but it is less pronounced. In contrast, for individuals who spend longer, uninterrupted periods in seated positions, the body becomes more accustomed to extended stillness. The internal systems adjust to this pattern, allowing the body to remain in a fixed posture for longer before signals become noticeable. However, this adjustment does not eliminate the underlying processes that lead to discomfort. It may simply delay their appearance. When signals do emerge, they may feel more concentrated, as they have had more time to develop without interruption. The transition from sitting to movement in this context can feel more abrupt, with a clearer sense of stiffness or resistance as the body shifts from one state to another. These differences can also be observed across different stages of life. Younger individuals, whose bodies are often exposed to a wider range of movement, may experience transitions more fluidly. Their tissues adapt quickly to changes in position, and the signals associated with prolonged stillness may take longer to accumulate. Older individuals or those whose routines involve more consistent patterns of sitting may experience these transitions differently. The body may respond more noticeably to changes in position, and the signals of discomfort may appear sooner or feel more defined. These variations do not suggest a simple progression from one state to another, but a complex interaction between the body's history and its current conditions. It is important to recognize that these patterns are not fixed. The body remains adaptable throughout life, and its responses can shift depending on how movement and stillness are arranged. A change in routine, whether it involves more variation or longer periods of uniformity, can influence how signals are generated and interpreted over time. This adaptability reflects the body's ongoing effort to maintain balance within the conditions it encounters, even when those conditions differ from earlier patterns. From a broader perspective, the differences between individuals highlight that the experience of discomfort after sitting is not determined by a single factor. It emerges from the interaction between the body's internal systems, the patterns of daily life, and the environment in which those patterns unfold. The same posture can be experienced in different ways depending on how it fits within this larger context. This suggests that the question of why the body feels pain after sitting too long cannot be answered by looking at posture alone. It requires an understanding of how the body is adapted to its environment, how it interprets sustained conditions, and how it transitions between states over time. The variations observed across individuals and stages of life provide a window into this process, showing that the body's response is both consistent in its underlying principles and flexible in its expression. To deepen this understanding, it becomes necessary to consider how these patterns continue to evolve as environments change further, and how the balance between movement and stillness may shift in ways that influence future experiences of the body. As these differences between individuals and across stages of life continue to unfold, a broader pattern begins to appear, one that is less about any single posture and more about how the body relates to time itself. The body does not simply respond to what is happening in a moment. It responds to sequences, to repetitions, to the way experiences are arranged across hours, days, and years. When a particular pattern, such as prolonged sitting, repeats often enough, it becomes part of how the body anticipates the world. The nervous system begins to expect certain conditions to persist, and it adjusts how it interprets signals within those conditions. This anticipation does not replace the body's deeper tendencies, but it layers over them, creating a more complex response. At the same time, the body continues to carry its long-established expectation of variation. It has been shaped by a history in which movement was continuous, where stillness was temporary, and where small adjustments were always present. These two patterns, repetition of stillness in the present and expectation of variation from the past, do not fully align. They coexist, influencing how the body generates and interprets sensation. When the present pattern of stillness extends for long periods, the underlying expectation of variation begins to surface more clearly. The signals that emerge, whether subtle or more pronounced, reflect this interaction. Over time, this interaction can create a rhythm in which discomfort is not tied to a single moment, but to the accumulation of repeated sequences. A person may sit for long periods each day, and the body may adapt to this pattern to some extent. But the signals that arise do not disappear. They may shift in timing, in intensity, or in how they are experienced, but they remain part of the body's ongoing communication. Each period of stillness contributes to a broader pattern, and each transition back to movement temporarily restores balance. The cycle repeats, creating a continuous interplay between accumulation and release. This rhythm suggests that the body is not simply reacting to isolated events, but is continuously integrating its experiences over time. The discomfort felt after sitting for too long may therefore be influenced not only by the current duration of stillness, but by the repetition of similar durations in the past. The body's response becomes shaped by both immediate conditions and accumulated patterns, making the experience more complex than a single cause and effect relationship. From this perspective, the question of why the body feels pain after sitting too long begins to shift. It is no longer only about what is happening during a single period of sitting, but about how that period fits within a larger sequence of experiences. The body is responding to patterns that extend beyond the present moment, drawing on both recent repetition and long-standing tendencies. The signals that arise are part of this broader context, reflecting a system that is constantly balancing between adaptation and expectation. This understanding also suggests that the experience of discomfort is not fixed, but evolving. As patterns of daily life change, the body continues to adjust how it interprets and responds to sustained conditions. The same sequence may be experienced differently over time, depending on how often it is repeated and how it interacts with other aspects of life. The body remains flexible in its responses, even as it carries the influence of its history. This interplay between repetition and expectation brings the focus back to the relationship between the body and its environment. It suggests that the signals of discomfort are not isolated problems to be removed, but part of an ongoing dialogue. The body is continuously expressing how current conditions relate to patterns it has been shaped to expect. When those conditions align with variation, the signals remain quiet. When they diverge, the signals become more pronounced. The experience of pain after sitting for too long may therefore be one expression of this dialogue, a moment where the body indicates that the balance between stillness and movement has shifted beyond what it can maintain with ease. To carry this understanding further, it becomes necessary to return to the present and consider how this dialogue might continue in a world where environments are becoming increasingly stable, and where the patterns of movement and stillness may continue to change in ways that shape how the body feels in the future. As the patterns of sitting and movement continue to repeat across days and years, they begin to shape not only individual experience but also the shared conditions of entire populations. The environment in which people live becomes a common frame, influencing how bodies develop their expectations and responses over time. This does not occur through rapid biological change, but through consistent exposure to similar patterns of stillness and activity. When many individuals grow up within environments that allow prolonged sitting, the experience of the body itself begins to shift in subtle ways. What feels normal, what feels noticeable, and what draws attention are all influenced by the conditions that are encountered most often. For a child growing up in a setting where much of the day involves sitting, whether in learning, resting, or engaging with tasks that require focus, the body becomes familiar with extended periods of stability. The nervous system learns to interpret this stability as part of the expected pattern of daily life. Early signals of imbalance may remain in the background for longer, as the body adapts to the repeated experience of stillness. At the same time, the deeper expectation of variation, shaped over much longer periods of human history, does not disappear. It continues to influence how signals are generated, even if their interpretation shifts slightly. This creates a layered experience in which the body both accepts and questions the conditions it encounters. Across generations, this layering can become more pronounced. Each generation inherits not only the biological structure of the human body, but also the environmental patterns that shape how that structure is used. When environments remain consistent, when they continue to encourage prolonged sitting and reduce the need for movement, the patterns of experience also remain consistent. The body's responses may begin to adjust in timing and intensity, reflecting this repeated exposure. Signals that once appeared quickly may take longer to emerge, while others may feel more diffuse or less clearly defined. These changes do not indicate a fundamental shift in the body's design, but rather an ongoing adjustment in how its communication system operates within a stable environment. At the same time, variation still exists within populations. Not all individuals experience the same patterns to the same degree. Differences in daily routines, in types of activity, and in the balance between movement and stillness continue to shape how the body responds. Some may experience discomfort sooner, others later. Some may feel it more strongly, others more subtly. These differences reflect the interaction between shared environmental patterns and individual variation in experience. They show that while the broader conditions influence the body, the specific response remains flexible and responsive to context. This perspective highlights that the experience of pain after sitting is not only a personal phenomenon, but also part of a larger pattern that emerges across groups of people. It reflects how environments, when shared, can shape the conditions under which the body operates. The signals that arise are not isolated events, but part of a broader expression of how the human body interacts with a world that has changed in its structure and stability. Understanding this broader pattern does not lead to a single conclusion, but it provides a context in which individual experiences can be seen as part of something larger. The discomfort felt in one moment is connected to patterns that extend beyond that moment, influenced by both personal history and shared conditions. To explore this further, it becomes necessary to consider how these shared patterns might continue to evolve, and how future environments may shape the balance between movement and stillness in ways that influence how the body feels over time. As these shared patterns continue across generations, they begin to influence not only how the body responds, but how its signals are understood. The experience of discomfort, which once might have been interpreted as a natural prompt for movement, can gradually take on different meanings depending on the environment in which it occurs. When prolonged sitting becomes a normal part of daily life, the signals that arise from it are no longer unusual. They become familiar, expected, and often reinterpreted as something separate from the body's ongoing dialogue. Instead of being seen as part of a continuous pattern of adjustment, they may be viewed as interruptions, as inconveniences that appear without clear context. This shift in interpretation does not change the signals themselves, but it changes how they are received. In earlier conditions, where movement was closely tied to the environment, a signal of discomfort would naturally lead to a change in position. The response was immediate and often unconscious, guided by the surroundings. In modern settings, where the environment allows stillness to continue, the same signal may not lead to an immediate response. Attention may remain focused elsewhere, and the body may remain in the same position even as discomfort begins to develop. Over time, this can alter the relationship between sensation and action. The signals that once guided movement become easier to overlook, and the response to them becomes less automatic. This change can create a subtle gap between what the body is communicating and how that communication is acted upon. The body continues to generate signals based on its internal state, but the environment no longer reinforces those signals in the same way. As a result, the process of responding to discomfort may become more delayed, more dependent on conscious decision rather than on immediate adjustment. This delay allows signals to accumulate, increasing the likelihood that they will become more pronounced before a response occurs. In this way, the experience of pain may become more common, not because the body is encountering more extreme conditions, but because the pathway from sensation to movement has been altered. This altered pathway can also influence how discomfort is perceived over time. When signals are repeatedly delayed or overlooked, they may begin to feel less predictable. A person may not notice the early stages of discomfort, and when the sensation becomes clear, it may appear to have emerged suddenly. This can make it more difficult to connect the sensation to the conditions that produced it. The body's communication becomes less transparent, not because it has changed, but because the context in which it is interpreted has shifted. Across generations, this pattern of interpretation can become part of how people understand their own bodies. The expectation that discomfort will appear during prolonged sitting may become normalized, even if the underlying reasons are not always clear. The signals are accepted as part of the experience, but their role as prompts for variation may be less recognized. This does not eliminate the body's need for change, but it changes how that need is expressed and understood. From a broader perspective, this suggests that the experience of pain is shaped not only by physical conditions, but also by the relationship between sensation and meaning. The body generates signals based on its internal state, but the way those signals are interpreted influences how they are experienced. When interpretation shifts, the experience can change, even if the underlying processes remain the same. This adds another layer to the understanding of discomfort during prolonged sitting. It is not only about what the body is doing, but also about how its signals are received within a given environment. To continue this exploration, it becomes necessary to consider how this evolving relationship between sensation and interpretation might influence future patterns, and how the body's communication may continue to adapt as environments become even more stable and structured over time. As the relationship between sensation and interpretation continues to shift, the body's signals begin to exist within a landscape that is not only physical, but also shaped by expectation. Over time, repeated experiences of sitting and the discomfort that may follow can form a quiet pattern in how the body is anticipated. A person may begin to expect that after a certain period of stillness, a familiar sensation will appear. This expectation does not create the signal, but it can influence how it is noticed, how quickly it comes into awareness, and how it is understood once it arrives. The body and the mind, in this sense, are not separate processes. They are part of a continuous loop in which signals are generated, interpreted, and anticipated over time. When this loop repeats often enough, it can begin to shape the experience itself. The anticipation of discomfort may lead to earlier awareness of subtle signals, bringing them forward before they would have been noticed otherwise. In other cases, the expectation that discomfort is unavoidable may lead to a delayed response, allowing the body to remain in the same position even as signals accumulate. These variations do not change the underlying processes within the body, but they influence how those processes are experienced from moment to moment. In earlier human environments, this loop between sensation and expectation may have been less pronounced in this specific form. The conditions that led to prolonged stillness were less common, and the signals associated with imbalance were more directly tied to immediate environmental changes. A slight discomfort would lead to a shift, and the cycle would resolve quickly. The anticipation of extended discomfort may not have been a regular part of experience, because the conditions that produced it did not persist long enough to form such patterns. In modern settings, where the same conditions can repeat daily, the loop becomes more established. The body continues to generate signals based on sustained patterns, and the mind begins to recognize those patterns over time. This recognition can influence how the signals are integrated into awareness, creating a layered experience in which physical conditions and expectation interact. The discomfort that arises after sitting for too long may therefore be shaped not only by the current state of the body, but also by the accumulated memory of similar states. This does not suggest that pain is imagined or constructed independently of the body. Rather, it reflects a system in which physical signals and interpretive processes are closely connected. The body provides continuous information, and the mind organizes that information into a meaningful experience. When patterns repeat, the organization of those signals becomes more efficient, and the experience may appear more quickly or more clearly. This perspective adds depth to the understanding of why discomfort can feel both familiar and variable at the same time. It is familiar because it follows a pattern that has been experienced before. It is variable because the interaction between physical conditions and expectation can change from one moment to another. The body remains consistent in its underlying processes, but the way those processes are brought into awareness can shift depending on context, attention, and prior experience. From a broader viewpoint, this suggests that the experience of pain after sitting is part of an evolving dialogue between the body and its environment, shaped by both immediate conditions and accumulated patterns. The signals that arise are not isolated events, but part of a sequence that includes perception, interpretation, and anticipation. This sequence continues to develop as the environment remains stable and the patterns of daily life repeat. The body, in turn, continues to communicate within this changing context, adjusting how its signals are expressed and how they are perceived. To bring this exploration toward its final stage, it becomes necessary to return to the central question and consider what this long interaction between body, environment, and time suggests about the experience of sitting itself, and what it reveals about the way the human body continues to adapt to a world that has changed faster than its deeper patterns. When the body's signals are shaped not only by immediate conditions, but also by patterns that have repeated over time, the experience of sitting begins to reveal something broader about how the human body adapts. Adaptation, in this sense, is not a complete transformation. It is a process of adjustment that occurs within limits. The body can learn to tolerate new patterns, to function within them, and to interpret them as part of what is expected. But this learning does not replace the deeper structures and tendencies that were shaped over much longer periods. Instead, both layers remain active, influencing how the body responds in any given moment. In the case of prolonged sitting, this creates a situation where the body can adapt enough to remain in a fixed posture for extended periods, yet still generates signals that suggest something is missing. The adaptation allows the body to function within the modern environment. It can sit, remain still, and carry out tasks that require sustained attention. At the same time, the underlying expectation of variation continues to shape how the body interprets these conditions. When stillness persists, the signals that emerge reflect this expectation. They are not a sign that the body has failed to adapt, but that adaptation has occurred within a system that still carries its original tendencies. This dual nature of adaptation can be seen in how discomfort develops gradually rather than immediately. If the body were entirely unsuited to prolonged sitting, the response would be more immediate and more pronounced. Instead, the body allows stillness to continue for a time, adjusting to the conditions and maintaining function. Only as the duration extends does the absence of variation begin to register more clearly. The signals appear slowly, building from subtle awareness into more noticeable discomfort. This pattern suggests that the body is balancing between two states, one that accommodates the present environment and one that reflects its longer history. This balance is not static. It shifts depending on how the body is used, how often patterns are repeated, and how the environment supports or interrupts those patterns. When variation is reintroduced, even briefly, the body responds quickly. Signals of discomfort can diminish, and the sense of balance returns. When stillness continues, the signals build again, following the same gradual progression. This responsiveness indicates that the body remains flexible, even as it operates within new conditions. From a broader perspective, this form of adaptation highlights a key aspect of how the human body interacts with change. It does not instantly reshape itself to match new environments. Instead, it adjusts its responses within the framework of its existing structure. The result is a system that can function across a range of conditions, but that continues to express preferences shaped by its history. The discomfort associated with sitting for too long may be one expression of this preference. It reflects a body that can remain still, but that has not been shaped to do so without variation for extended periods. This understanding moves the focus away from viewing pain as a simple problem to be removed, and towards seeing it as part of an ongoing process of adaptation. The signals that arise are not obstacles to be eliminated, but indications of how the body is negotiating between past and present conditions. They provide insight into the limits of adaptation, showing where the current environment begins to diverge from what the body can maintain with ease. To continue this exploration, it becomes necessary to consider how these limits are experienced in everyday life, and how the balance between adaptation and underlying tendency shapes the way people perceive their own bodies over time. When adaptation continues within these limits, the experience of the body in everyday life begins to take on a quieter, more layered quality. Discomfort does not always appear as something sudden or disruptive. Instead, it often exists as a gradual presence, something that builds slowly and becomes noticeable only when attention shifts toward it. This pattern can make it difficult to distinguish between what the body has accepted and what it continues to question. A person may sit for long periods without immediate difficulty, carrying out tasks and moving through the day with little awareness of change. Yet beneath this surface, the body is continuously adjusting its internal state, responding to the persistence of stillness in ways that are not always brought into focus. This creates a subtle distinction between what feels manageable and what is truly balanced. The body can manage a condition for a time, maintaining function and delaying stronger signals. But management is not the same as alignment with its deeper tendencies. Over time, the difference between these two states begins to emerge through sensation. A posture that feels neutral at first may gradually feel less comfortable. A position that can be maintained without effort may begin to require small adjustments to remain tolerable. These changes are often slight, and they may not interrupt activity, but they reflect an ongoing negotiation within the body, one that continues even when it is not consciously recognized. In modern environments where prolonged sitting is common, this negotiation becomes part of the background of daily life. The body learns to operate within patterns that are repeated regularly, and it adjusts its responses accordingly. Signals that might once have appeared sooner may now take longer to become noticeable, as the body becomes familiar with the conditions that produce them. At the same time, when these signals do reach awareness, they may feel more persistent, as if they have been present for some time before being recognized. This delayed clarity can make the experience of discomfort feel disconnected from its origin, even though it follows a consistent pattern. Another aspect of this process involves how individuals come to understand their own bodies. When discomfort appears regularly in similar contexts, it may begin to feel like a fixed part of experience rather than a signal that reflects changing conditions. The body's communication can become something that is expected but not fully examined, a background presence that is accepted without clear interpretation. This does not diminish the signal itself, but it changes how it is perceived and responded to. The body continues to express the same patterns, but the meaning of those patterns becomes less distinct. From a broader perspective, this suggests that the experience of sitting and discomfort is not only shaped by physical conditions, but also by familiarity. As patterns repeat, they become integrated into how the body is experienced, making it more difficult to separate what is usual from what is necessary. The signals that arise may be interpreted as part of a normal state, even when they indicate a divergence from the body's preferred conditions. This familiarity can make the experience of discomfort feel less urgent, even as it continues to develop in the background. At the same time, the body remains responsive. When variation is reintroduced, when movement interrupts stillness, the change is often felt quickly. The contrast reveals that the previous state was not entirely neutral, even if it had been accepted as such. This contrast provides a glimpse into the underlying patterns that continue to shape the body's responses, reminding us that adaptation has limits and that the signals of discomfort remain connected to those limits. To bring this exploration closer to its conclusion, it becomes necessary to consider what these patterns reveal about the relationship between the human body and the environments it now inhabits, and how this relationship may continue to evolve as the conditions of daily life become increasingly stable and structured over time. As this distinction between what the body can tolerate and what it finds naturally balanced becomes clearer, the relationship between the human body and its environment begins to feel less like a perfect fit and more like an ongoing adjustment. The environments in which people now spend most of their time are often stable, predictable, and designed for continuity. They allow tasks to be completed without interruption, and they support the body in ways that reduce the need for constant movement. At the same time, the body itself continues to carry patterns that were shaped in conditions where variation was constant and stillness was rarely extended without change. These two realities do not fully align, and the space between them becomes visible through the signals the body produces. The discomfort that arises after sitting for too long can be understood as part of this space. It is not a failure of the body to function within modern conditions, nor is it a simple flaw in those conditions. It reflects a difference in how stability and variation are balanced. The body can remain still, but it does not fully settle into stillness without the presence of change. The environment can support stability, but it does not always provide the variation that the body has long been shaped to expect. The result is a quiet tension, one that does not always demand attention, but that becomes more noticeable as time passes. This tension is not constant in its expression. It can remain subtle for long periods, appearing only as a slight urge to shift or a gradual sense of stiffness. At other times, it becomes more defined, taking the form of discomfort or pain that draws attention more clearly. These variations do not indicate that the body is inconsistent, but that it is responding dynamically to a relationship that is still adjusting. The signals it produces are part of an ongoing attempt to maintain balance within conditions that differ from those in which its patterns were formed. From a broader perspective, this relationship highlights a key aspect of human experience. The body is not separate from the environment, but continuously shaped by it. When the environment changes more quickly than the body's deeper patterns, the interaction between the two becomes more complex. The body adapts where it can, adjusting its responses and extending its range of tolerance. But it also continues to express preferences that are rooted in its history, signaling when conditions move beyond what it can maintain with ease. The experience of sitting, when viewed through this lens, becomes more than a simple daily habit. It becomes a point of contact between past and present, between patterns shaped over long periods and conditions that have emerged more recently. The discomfort that appears is not only about the posture itself, but about how that posture fits within this larger relationship. It is a signal that reflects both the body's ability to adapt and the limits of that adaptation. This perspective does not lead to a single conclusion, or a clear resolution. Instead, it opens a space for observing how the body continues to respond within changing environments. It suggests that the signals of discomfort are not problems to be removed entirely, but expressions of an ongoing dialogue. The body is continuously indicating how current conditions relate to its deeper patterns, and these indications can be understood as part of a larger process of adjustment. As environments continue to evolve, becoming more structured and stable, this dialogue may also continue to change. The body will likely keep adapting, finding new ways to function within these conditions, but it may also continue to express the need for variation, reminding us that its deeper patterns remain present even as the world around it shifts. To bring this exploration to its final stage, it becomes necessary to return once more to the central question, not to provide a fixed answer, but to consider what this long interaction between body, environment, and time suggests about the experience of sitting itself, and what it reveals about the way the human body continues to live within a world that is still changing. When the question returns why the body begins to feel pain after sitting for too long, it no longer stands as a single problem waiting for a direct answer. It opens into a wider view, one that includes the body's long history, the structure of the modern environment, and the patterns that connect them across time. The experience of discomfort, which at first seems simple and immediate, reveals itself as part of a gradual process. It begins with small changes that are barely noticed, continues through a quiet accumulation of signals, and eventually becomes clear enough to draw attention. This process does not point to a single cause. It reflects an interaction, one that unfolds slowly and continuously as the body remains in conditions that differ from those it has long been shaped to expect. The body does not resist stillness entirely. It allows stillness to exist, even to persist for a time, but it appears to do so with an underlying expectation that stillness will include variation, that it will be interrupted by small movements and adjustments that maintain balance. When this expectation is not met, the signals that arise do not appear all at once. They develop gradually, moving from subtle awareness to more defined discomfort. The sensation of pain, in this sense, is not a sudden event, but the visible point of a longer sequence that has been unfolding beneath the surface. This understanding shifts the way the question can be held. Instead of asking only what causes the pain, it becomes possible to ask what the pain is part of. It is part of a system that monitors patterns over time, that responds not only to intensity but to persistence, and that reflects both the body's capacity to adapt and the limits of that adaptation. The discomfort that follows prolonged sitting may therefore be seen not as an isolated problem, but as a signal that arises when a certain balance has been extended beyond what the body can quietly maintain. When viewed in this way, the experience of sitting becomes less about a single posture and more about how that posture fits within a larger pattern. The body is not responding only to the position itself, but to how long it remains unchanged, how often it is repeated, and how it interacts with other moments of movement throughout the day. The signals that emerge reflect this broader context, integrating information across time rather than reacting to a single point. From this perspective, the question remains open. It does not resolve into a fixed conclusion, because the conditions it describes are not fixed. The body continues to adapt, the environment continues to change, and the patterns of daily life continue to evolve. The signals that arise will shift with these changes, reflecting new balances and new tensions as they emerge. What remains consistent is the presence of the dialogue itself. The body continues to communicate through sensation, indicating how current conditions relate to its deeper patterns. The discomfort felt after sitting for too long is one expression of this communication, shaped by the interaction between stillness and movement, between repetition and variation, between present conditions and long-standing tendencies. As this exploration comes to rest, the original question lingers, not as something to be solved completely, but as something to be observed more quietly. If the body can remain still and yet gradually move toward discomfort, if it can adapt and yet continue to signal a need for change, then what does that suggest about the kind of balance it is always seeking, and whether that balance is ever fully reached, or only continuously approached over time? If the question remains open, then the way it is held begins to matter more than the search for a final answer. The body, throughout this long exploration, has not presented a single point of failure or a simple explanation. Instead, it has revealed a pattern, one that unfolds slowly, quietly, and consistently across time. Sitting in itself is not the source of the experience. It is a condition within a larger sequence, a moment where stillness is allowed to continue long enough for something deeper to become visible. The discomfort that follows is not an interruption of normal function, but part of the way the body expresses how that sequence is unfolding. It suggests that the body does not define balance as the absence of sensation, but as the presence of ongoing change. When change is present, even in small and subtle forms, the body remains within a range it can maintain without drawing attention. When change is reduced, the signals begin to gather, gradually forming a sensation that asks for something different. This does not happen all at once. It builds layer by layer as time passes without variation. The experience that eventually emerges, whether it is described as stiffness, heaviness, or pain, is not separate from this process. It is the moment when the process becomes clear enough to be noticed. In this sense, the body is not simply reacting to sitting, it is responding to a pattern in which stillness has extended beyond its usual place within a sequence of movement. The signals that arise are not isolated events, they are part of a continuous dialogue, one that reflects how the body is positioned within its environment over time. Each moment of sitting carries with it the influence of previous moments, and each signal that appears is shaped by both the present and the accumulation of what has come before. This understanding does not point toward a single change or a fixed solution. Instead, it invites a different way of observing the experience itself. The body's signals can be seen as expressions of relationship between movement and stillness, between adaptation and expectation, between what has been and what is now. When discomfort appears, it is not only a reaction, but an indication of how these elements are interacting in that moment. It reflects a condition that has developed gradually, one that becomes visible only when the accumulation reaches a certain point. As this view settles, the role of the body becomes less about correcting a problem and more about revealing a pattern. The sensations that arise are part of how the body remains connected to its own history, even as it exists within a changing environment. They show that adaptation is not a complete transformation, but an ongoing process, one that continues to negotiate between different conditions without fully resolving them into a single state. In the quiet space where this understanding rests, the original experience of sitting can be seen differently. It is no longer just a position, but a point within a larger flow, one that includes movement, time, repetition, and change. The discomfort that may appear is part of this flow, not separate from it. It is a signal that something within the sequence has remained unchanged for longer than the body can easily sustain. And as the body continues to move through this sequence, adjusting, responding, and expressing its signals, the question remains gently present, not as something to be answered once, but as something to be returned to again and again. If the body continues to seek change even within stillness, what does that suggest about the kind of balance it is always moving toward, and whether that balance is something that can ever be fully held or only briefly touched before it shifts once more? And so the question returns once more, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet persistence, as if it belongs to the same slow rhythm that the body itself follows. What began as a simple observation, a feeling of discomfort after sitting too long, has gradually unfolded into something wider, something that does not point to a single cause, but to a relationship that continues to evolve over time. The body, when seen in this way, is not reacting to an isolated moment. It is responding to patterns, to sequences, to the way stillness and movement are arranged across the day and across a lifetime. Sitting, then, is no longer just a posture. It becomes a pause within a larger flow, one that carries with it the memory of movement before it and the anticipation of movement after. When this pause remains brief, when it is part of a sequence that continues to change, the body remains quiet. Its signals do not need to rise to the surface. They remain within that background rhythm, adjusting, redistributing, maintaining balance in ways that are barely noticeable. But when the pause extends, when stillness begins to hold its place for longer than expected, something subtle begins to shift. The quiet adjustments that once defined rest begin to fade, and in their absence, the body starts to gather information in a different way. This gathering is not immediate. It does not appear as a clear signal at first. It forms slowly, as pressure remains in the same places, as muscles hold their state without release, as the internal flows become more uniform. Each of these changes is small on its own, almost insignificant, but together and over time they begin to align. The body does not ignore this alignment, it interprets it, and from that interpretation, a sensation begins to take shape not suddenly, but gradually, moving from the background into awareness. What is felt as discomfort is not a single event, but the surface of a process that has been unfolding quietly all along. In this light, pain does not stand apart from the body's natural state. It belongs to the same system that maintains balance, that responds to change, that adjusts continuously even when no movement is visible. It is not a sign that something has broken, but that something has remained unchanged for too long. It is the body's way of marking a point within a sequence, indicating that the pattern has reached a moment where variation is needed once more. This does not mean that the body is unable to adapt. It clearly does. It allows stillness. It supports long periods of focus. It adjusts to the structures of the modern environment in ways that make daily life possible. But adaptation, as it appears here, is not a replacement of one pattern with another. It is a layering. The body learns to function within new conditions, while still carrying the expectations formed over much longer periods. These expectations do not disappear. They remain present, shaping how signals are generated and how they are eventually felt. The result is a kind of quiet tension, not a conflict, but a space where two patterns meet. On one side, there is the stability of the present environment, allowing stillness to extend. On the other, there is the body's tendency toward variation, toward continuous subtle change. Where these two meet, the signals of discomfort begin to form. They are not abrupt, and they are not absolute. They move slowly, just as the body itself moves through time, adjusting, responding, never entirely fixed. And so, as everything settles, the original question no longer feels like something that requires a final answer. It becomes something that can remain open, something that can be returned to without urgency. If the body continues to signal after stillness, if it continues to shift even when it appears at rest, then perhaps what we call rest has never been the absence of movement at all. Perhaps it has always been something quieter, something that unfolds beneath awareness, something that continues even when nothing seems to be happening. And if that is the case, then when the body begins to feel pain after sitting too long, is it really reacting to stillness itself? Or is it simply reminding us that stillness, as the body understands it, was never meant to be completely still in the first place?